Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, and tonight I'll guide you through chilling, scary stories to fall asleep to. No ads, no interruptions, just a black screen and the sound of rain. This is your show, your escape into the dark. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always intrigued by when and where you join us, and deeply grateful for your presence. If you enjoy the eerie calm of these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's begin. I never thought moving into an apartment could feel so wrong. It was supposed to be a fresh start, you know? After the breakup, I needed something new, something that didn't remind me of everything I was leaving behind. I found this place. It was old but charming, in a mid-sized city, with tall ceilings and creaky floors. The kind of place where you can feel the history in the walls. It wasn't expensive, and the landlord seemed eager to get someone in quickly, which worked for me. The first couple of days were pretty standard, unpacking, getting used to the space, figuring out where I'd put everything. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange, though. The first night, as I was lying in bed, I thought I heard a voice. It was faint, like it was far off, but it seemed to come from the wall right next to my bed. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just the building settling or maybe noise from another apartment. The place was old, after all, and I figured these kinds of things happened in old buildings. Still, it was enough to make me pause for a second, wondering if I was hearing things. But I convinced myself it was nothing and went to sleep. The next morning, I didn't think much about it. It's funny how easy it is to brush off things that don't seem to make sense. I was focused on getting everything in order, and before I knew it, I'd forgotten about the noise. At least, I thought I had. But that night, as soon as I lay down, it happened again. That same soft whisper, barely audible, but definitely there. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was having a conversation in the walls. I sat up, confused, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy, like something wasn't quite right. I even pressed my ear against the wall, trying to catch more of it. But it just faded away, leaving me feeling ridiculous. Who listens to their walls like that? I laughed at myself and tried to forget about it, but it stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. Over the next few days, the whispers kept coming, not every night, but enough to notice. Enough to make me start waiting for them, almost expecting them. It was always the same, soft, barely there whispers, like someone was talking just out of reach. I couldn't explain it, and every time I tried to catch more, the sound would fade, leaving me more confused than before. I even started checking the walls during the day, trying to find any logical explanation. But there was nothing, no cracks, no vents that could explain the noise. I wanted to believe it was just the building making strange sounds. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. I wasn't scared, not yet, just curious and a little on edge. The guy across the hall, 2C, kept asking how I was settling in. I saw him almost every day, and he always had the same questions. How are you finding the place? Is everything to your liking? He seemed friendly enough, but a little too interested, if you know what I mean. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I started avoiding him when I could, not wanting to answer the same questions again and again. But the whispers kept happening. I began to notice they would come at the same time, almost like clockwork, around 2 or 3 in the morning. It was strange, and it started to mess with my sleep. I'd lie there, listening, waiting for the whispers to start, wondering what they meant. Each time they came, it felt like they were closer, like they were just on the other side of the wall. One night, I thought I heard my own name. It was so faint, I wasn't sure, but it sent a chill through me. I got out of bed, looked around the room, but of course, nothing was there. Just the quiet of the apartment. But it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was the kind that made you question what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few weeks in, things started getting worse. The whispers weren't just happening at night anymore. They were happening during the day too. I'd be sitting in the living room, watching TV or reading, and I'd hear them. Soft, faint, but there. Always there. It was starting to get to me. I couldn't focus on anything without feeling like I was being watched or listened to. I even tried talking to the landlord about it, but he just shrugged it off. "It's an old building," he said. "These things happen." But that wasn't enough for me. I knew something was off, but I didn't know what. I started searching the apartment, moving furniture, checking every nook and cranny. That's when I found it. Behind the bookshelf, there was a small hole in the wall. At first, I thought it was just some damage from the previous tenant. But when I looked closer, I saw a small camera, barely visible, hidden in the wall. It was pointed right at my bed. I felt a cold wave of realization hit me. Someone had been watching me. The moment I saw that camera, everything clicked into place. The whispers, the strange feeling I had about the apartment, it all made sense. Someone was watching me, recording me, and I had no idea how long it had been going on. I ripped the camera out of the wall, but that didn't make me feel any better. It just made me realize that if there was one camera, there were probably more. I started tearing through the apartment, looking for anything out of place. I found two more, one in the bathroom and another behind the TV. Whoever had set this up had done a good job hiding them. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but I felt so paranoid, like no one would believe me. Instead, I started thinking about the guy in 2C. He'd always been so interested in my apartment, asking all those questions. It had to be him, right? Who else could it be? I didn't sleep that night, too scared to close my eyes, afraid of what might be happening when I wasn't looking. The next morning, I finally called the police. They came, looked at the cameras, and agreed something wasn't right. They asked me about my neighbors, and I told them about the guy in 2C. They took him in for questioning, but nothing came of it. He denied everything, said he didn't know anything about the cameras, but I knew it was him. They searched his apartment, but they didn't find anything. In the end, the landlord agreed to change the locks, but that didn't make me feel safer. Even after the cameras were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I moved out a month later, couldn't stay there any longer. But even in my new place, I keep checking the walls, looking for holes, for signs that someone's watching. It's hard to shake the feeling once it's there. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I never thought anything like this would happen. It was your typical quiet suburban street, all neat lawns and friendly but distant neighbors. The kind of place where everyone minds their own business, except for one person. Miss Mallory. She lived right next door in the oldest house on the block, her yard overgrown with wild plants that seemed to have a life of their own. The first time I saw her, she was hunched over, pulling weeds from her front yard, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite make out. I waved, trying to be polite, but she just glanced at me with a strange look and went back to her garden. People around the neighborhood didn't talk much about her, but when they did, it was always with a strange sort of reverence. They'd say things like, "Don't mess with Ms. Mallory's garden, or you'll regret it," or "Her garden's cursed, I'm telling you." I figured it was all nonsense. Old people like to believe in strange things, right? But something about her garden made me uncomfortable from the start. It was always dark and twisted, with vines crawling up the sides of her house, almost like they were trying to pull it down. And no matter what time of day it was, there was a strange smell coming from it, something damp and earthy, but with a hint of something foul mixed in. One day, as I was getting my mail, Miss Mallory finally spoke to me. "You stay away from my garden," she said, her voice low and serious. "It's cursed." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her face remained stone cold. "Don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and shuffled back into her house, leaving me standing there, unsure of what to think. I tried to forget about it, but every time I looked at that garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about it seemed off in a way I couldn't explain, and the more I thought about it, The more I started to believe maybe there was more to her words than I wanted to admit. The days went on, and I tried to put the whole cursed garden thing out of my mind, but it wasn't so easy. Strange things started happening around my house, little things that I couldn't explain away. My plants started dying, even though I watered them regularly. At first, I thought maybe I wasn't taking care of them properly, but then it got worse. Flowers that had been perfectly healthy one day would be wilted and brown the next. One night, I heard noises coming from Miss Mallory's yard. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds were strange, like something was being dragged across the ground. I glanced out my window, and for a moment, I thought I saw shadows moving between her plants. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The next morning I found a dead cat at the edge of her garden. Its fur was matted and its eyes were wide open, staring lifelessly into the sky. I was shaken, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Cats die all the time, right? But when I mentioned it to Miss Mallory, she gave me a look I'll never forget. "Leave the garden alone," she said, her voice flat and cold. "That's where it begins." What begins? I wanted to ask, but the way she said it made me back off. That's when I started noticing other strange things around her property. The smell coming from the garden grew stronger, more pungent, like something rotten was hidden beneath the surface. And every night, I'd hear the same noises, dragging sounds, low whispers, and sometimes the faintest sound of laughter. I tried talking to the other neighbors about it, but they just shrugged it off, saying Miss Mallory was harmless, just a little eccentric. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing, what I was hearing. Something was happening in that garden, and whatever it was, I wasn't going to be able to ignore it for much longer. One night, it all came to a head. I was in my living room, trying to relax after a long day, when I heard it again, that dragging noise, only this time it was louder, more frantic. I couldn't just sit there and pretend it wasn't happening. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew I had to see it for myself. As I approached the fence that separated our yards, I saw movement in the shadows. Miss Mallory was out there, kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in something dark and sticky. She was digging, frantically pulling up the earth like she was looking for something buried deep beneath the surface. Standing over her was a tall figure, hooded and silent, watching her every move. I crouched behind the bushes, barely daring to breathe, watching as she dug deeper and deeper into the ground. The hooded figure leaned down and whispered something to her, and Miss Mallory let out a strange, high-pitched laugh. It sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, she stopped digging and looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her voice sharp and threatening. Before I could move, the hooded figure turned towards me, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something inhuman in the shadows of their face. I ran. The next morning, I didn't see Miss Mallory at all. Her house was quiet, the garden untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still very wrong. I decided to go back. I had to know what I saw, what they were doing. As I crept closer to the garden, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were bags of fertilizer stacked behind her shed, but they didn't look like the kind you'd use for gardening. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened one. It wasn't fertilizer. It was something much worse. I started piecing it together, the strange visitors late at night, the smells, the shadows. Miss Mallory wasn't some harmless old woman obsessed with witchcraft. She was hiding something, something dangerous. The hooded figure, the digging, the laughter, it all pointed to one thing. She was using her garden as a front for something illegal, something she didn't want anyone to find out about. And she had been using the rumors of witchcraft, of curses, to keep people away, to keep them from discovering the truth. I had stumbled onto something much darker than I ever expected, and now I was caught in the middle of it. Miss Mallory disappeared after that night. No one saw her leave, no one knew where she went. But the police came. They found enough evidence in her garden to link her to a local drug operation. But she was long gone by then. The garden was torn apart, the house emptied, but it didn't feel like it was over. Not for me. I couldn't forget what I saw. The hooded figure, the whispers in the night, the digging in the dark. It stayed with me, haunting my every thought. Even now, weeks later, I still find myself looking out my window at her overgrown yard, waiting for something to move in the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it. That same dragging sound, faint but unmistakable. Part of me wants to believe it's just my imagination, but another part of me knows. Miss Mallory may be gone, but whatever she was involved in, that's not something that just goes away. It started on a gray, rainy evening. Michael and I had planned to spend the weekend in a small coastal town, something quiet to take our minds off the stress of planning a wedding. We were walking through the town's narrow streets, wet pavement, shining under dim streetlights, when I spotted a tiny, almost forgotten antique shop. Something about the place felt timeless, like it had been standing there for centuries, unnoticed by most people who passed by. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood, shelves stacked with trinkets and relics from long ago. That's when I saw it. An old gold wedding ring, tucked away in the corner of a glass display case, half hidden under a tarnished silver locket. It caught my eye instantly. I don't know why, but something about it seemed different. The shopkeeper was an older woman with thin, wiry hair that barely moved as she shuffled over to me. She peered at me through her spectacles as I asked about the ring. "That one?" she asked slowly, her voice dragging. "You should be careful with it. There's a story tied to that ring, you know." I almost laughed it off, but there was something in her tone that made me pause. "A curse," she said, a little too casually, as if it were an afterthought. She didn't elaborate, just stared at me with a blank expression. Of course, I didn't believe in curses. I bought the ring, more for the novelty than anything. It wasn't like I was going to wear it, after all. But later that night, back in our rental, I couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. A cursed wedding ring. It sounded absurd, but I felt a strange sense of discomfort settle in the back of my mind. It wasn't until we got back home from that weekend trip that things started to change. At first, it was small things. Michael began coming home later than usual, claiming work had been overwhelming. He'd sit in the living room, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging me when I spoke. I chalked it up to wedding stress. After all, planning a wedding was no small task. But it was more than that. I started noticing other things. The lights in the house seemed to flicker at odd times, plunging the room into an unsettling dimness for just a second or two. Items in the house would move from their usual places. My keys, my phone, even a pair of earrings I had left on the bathroom counter. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was just being forgetful. But then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving through the hallway. I sat up in bed, listening, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. When I asked Michael the next morning if he had gotten up in the night, he shrugged and said no. I tried not to let it get to me. But there was a growing discomfort in the pit of my stomach. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Every time I glanced at the ring I had bought, that old gold band, I felt a creeping sensation that made my thoughts wander. Maybe the curse was real. The turning point came one night when I found something I couldn't ignore. Michael had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he stepped outside for a smoke. I wasn't the type to snoop, but the phone buzzed with a message, and I glanced over without thinking. A message from someone named Lily. My heart skipped when I saw the words, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Miss you." I stood there frozen, staring at the screen, the air in the room suddenly heavy. Michael hadn't mentioned seeing anyone, let alone a Lily. I knew I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but something gnawed at me from the inside. All the late nights at work, the distance between us, the strange occurrences around the house, it all started to come together. Michael wasn't just distracted. He was hiding something. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I pretended everything was fine while I started digging. The more I looked, the more I found. Messages, emails, secret meetings. It wasn't just infidelity, it was deliberate, calculated. He had been lying to me for months, and the worst part was, he knew I was starting to catch on. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The cursed ring, the late nights, the lies, all of it pointed to something far darker than I could have imagined. I started watching him closely, noticing the way he acted when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The strange way he'd glance at me from across the room, almost like he was waiting for something. One night, while he was asleep, I took his phone again, and this time I went deeper. There were more messages from Lily, but there were also emails. Messages he had sent to a lawyer, asking about splitting assets, about preparing for divorce. He was planning to leave me, but that wasn't the worst part. In one of the emails, he mentioned something about a previous engagement, a woman named Emily. I didn't know much about his past relationships, but I knew enough to realize that something was seriously wrong. Emily had disappeared a few years ago, and no one knew why. Suddenly it all made sense. The strange happenings, the way Michael had been manipulating me, making me question my own sanity. He had done this before, and I was next. The day I decided to leave was a cold, rainy afternoon. I had packed a bag while Michael was at work, planning to be gone before he got home. But something told me to gather proof first. I needed to make sure he couldn't twist things around on me like he had done with Emily. So I set up my phone to record our next conversation. When he walked through the door that evening, I acted like everything was normal. But as we sat down to dinner, I brought up the messages from Lily. He didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "That's how it's going to be," he said, his voice cold and detached. He didn't even bother to explain. He just stared at me with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The conversation turned darker, his words more venomous, more revealing. It wasn't about love or betrayal anymore. It was about control. Michael had been playing me from the start. The gaslighting, the strange events around the house, all of it was meant to push me over the edge. But I had the proof I needed. The next morning, I handed the recording over to the police. Michael was arrested, charged with Emily's disappearance, and a slew of other crimes I hadn't even known about. But even though he was gone, the fear didn't leave me. Months later, I moved to a new city, far away from everything that had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that part of him was still watching me. And every time I thought about that cursed wedding ring, I couldn't help but wonder, was it really just a coincidence, or had the curse somehow been real after all? It was a rainy Wednesday when the letter from Aunt Margaret arrived. I hadn't heard from her in years. The last time I saw her, I was barely out of high school, sitting awkwardly at a family funeral. That was right after Lily died. The memory of her funeral still felt distant, like something I hadn't fully processed. I didn't want to go back to that part of my life, but the letter had a strange pull. Aunt Margaret's handwriting looked the same as it did back then, sharp and precise, every word carefully placed. She wrote that she was unwell, that she needed me to come to the family estate, and that there was something I needed to know about the family's legacy. I didn't understand what she meant by that. Our family was never the type to talk about any legacy, at least not when I was around. The estate, however, always held this heavy, old-world mystery. I hadn't been back since I was a teenager, and part of me was fine with that. It was far out in the country, surrounded by nothing but forests and hills. The kind of place that felt cut off from the rest of the world, even before you got there. But something about her letter gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake. So I packed my bag and set out the next day, driving through the rain. The road to the estate twisted and turned, barely lit by the weak afternoon light filtering through thick clouds. By the time I reached the gates, it was late, and the rain had turned into a steady downpour. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the iron gates, rusted and bent in places. I hadn't seen those gates in over 15 years, but they looked exactly the same as I remembered. Behind them, the estate loomed in the distance, barely visible through the rain. I hesitated before getting out, unsure if I was ready to face whatever Aunt Margaret wanted to tell me. Finally, I stepped out, pulling my jacket tight against the rain, and made my way to the gates. They groaned as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty landscape. The walk up the driveway felt longer than I remembered, but maybe that was just my nerves. By the time I reached the front door, I was soaked, the rain dripping from my hair and clothes. I knocked, expecting one of the old house staff to answer, but there was only silence. After a moment, I knocked again, harder this time, still nothing. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it creaked open easily. The hallway beyond was dark, except for a single dim light coming from the drawing room at the end. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and called out for Aunt Margaret. No answer. The air inside the house felt stale, like no one had lived there for a long time. I made my way toward the light, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the hall. When I reached the drawing room, I saw her sitting by the window, staring out into the rain. "Aunt Margaret?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me at first. It wasn't until I stepped closer that she finally spoke. "Sarah, you came, just like I knew you would." Her voice was thin, almost fragile, like it could break at any moment. I moved closer, unsure of what to say, but something about her tone made me uneasy. "It's been a long time," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. She didn't respond, just kept looking out the window, her hands folded in her lap. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then, finally, she turned to look at me, her eyes sharper than I expected. "You need to know the truth about this family, Sarah," she said, her voice stronger now. "The truth about why Lily died, and why you were always meant to come back here." I froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Lily's death had always been a mystery, an accident they called it, but Aunt Margaret's eyes told me there was more. So much more. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain pattering against the window. I had slept in one of the old guest rooms, the same one I used to stay in as a kid. Everything looked the same, untouched, as if no time had passed. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from last night, Aunt Margaret's words echoing with the truth about why Lily died. What did that mean? I got dressed and made my way downstairs, hoping to find Aunt Margaret, but the house was eerily quiet. I called out her name, but the only response was the rain tapping on the windows. After wandering the house for a bit, I decided to check the attic. It was the one place I hadn't gone since I arrived, and I vaguely remembered strange stories about it from when I was younger. The attic door was stiff, but it opened after a bit of force, revealing a steep set of stairs leading up. The light was dim, barely illuminating the dusty floorboards as I stepped inside. Boxes and old furniture were scattered everywhere, covered in thick layers of dust. I started looking through some of the boxes, not sure what I was searching for. Old family photos, faded letters, nothing unusual at first. But then I found a small wooden box tucked away in the corner, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. It was locked, but the lock looked weak, so I grabbed a nearby tool and pried it open. Inside I found a leather-bound book, old and worn, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it and quickly realized it wasn't just any book. The pages were filled with strange symbols, hand-drawn diagrams, and what looked like rituals. It was like something out of an old horror movie, but this felt real. I flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of it all, when I came across a name. Lily. Her name was written in the margins next to a symbol that looked disturbingly familiar. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. What was this? I had to talk to Aunt Margaret. There was something dark here, something hidden beneath the surface of this family, and I was starting to believe that Lily's death wasn't an accident after all. I found Aunt Margaret in the same spot, sitting by the window in the drawing room, her frail form hunched over. The rain hadn't let up, and the light outside was growing dim. I didn't waste any time. I pulled the book out of my bag and set it down in front of her. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked at the book, her eyes narrowing. For a long moment, she didn't speak, just stared at it like it was something dangerous. "Where did you find that?" she finally asked, her voice cold and distant. In the attic, buried under old blankets. What is this about, Aunt Margaret? She sighed, a deep, heavy sound like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. It's the truth, Sarah. The truth I've been trying to protect you from, but you had to go digging, didn't you? Her tone had shifted, no longer fragile or weak, but almost accusing. What truth? What does this have to do with Lily? She stood up, moving slowly to the fireplace, where she stared into the flames. Lily found that book too. She was curious, like you, too curious. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I waited for her to continue. She started asking questions, poking around where she didn't belong, and she paid the price for it. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What do you mean she paid the price? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Aunt Margaret turned to face me, her eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made for the good of the family, for the legacy to continue. The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. Lily's death hadn't been an accident. It was a sacrifice. A chill ran through me as I realized I was standing in the middle of something far more dangerous than I had imagined, and I had no idea how deep it went. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the old house felt like a threat. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my things in silence, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't know if Aunt Margaret would stop me, or worse, if she had others in the family who would. When I crept down the stairs, the house felt heavier, like it was watching me. The front door groaned as I opened it, and the rain hit me like a wall as I stepped outside. I hurried to my car, not looking back at the house, afraid that if I did, something would be waiting for me. The road out of the estate was slick, and my hands gripped the steering wheel tight as I drove away. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far from that place as possible. But even as I drove, Aunt Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made. It's been weeks since I left the estate, but the weight of what I learned hasn't left me. I'm staying in a small apartment now, far from the family, but I don't feel safe. I contacted the police. They opened an investigation into my family, into Lily's death, and into what I found in the attic. But every night, I can't help but feel like I'm still being watched. Detective Hughes told me that several bodies had been exhumed. All family members who had died under suspicious circumstances, but nothing concrete yet. Aunt Margaret is still out there, somewhere. And I know this isn't over. I got another letter yesterday. Same handwriting, same sharp slant. Blood runs deep, Sarah. You can't outrun it. It started with one of those aimless weekends where you don't have much planned, so you wander around town just to kill some time. I'd been to that flea market a dozen times before, the one at the edge of the city where people dump old junk hoping someone else will give it a second life. There wasn't much that caught my eye at first, just the usual dusty lamps, chipped china, and faded postcards nobody cared about. But then, something drew me to this small wooden stall, tucked away in the corner as if trying not to be found. Among the clutter, leaning against a pile of old books, was a framed photograph, black and white, with a kind of eerie stillness to it. It was a picture of a house, an old Victorian with peeling paint and vines creeping up the side, the kind that once had grandeur but had been forgotten by time. I'm not sure why I picked it up, but there was something about it that held my attention. The photograph felt cold to the touch, as if it had been left out in the rain, despite the fact the market was inside. The stall owner was an older woman, her eyes barely acknowledging me as I handed over a few dollars for the picture. She didn't seem to care about the item, more relieved that someone was taking it off her hands. I didn't ask any questions, and she didn't offer any stories. That's how I left, carrying the picture home, thinking it would look good hanging in the hallway by the stairs. By the time I got home, it was late afternoon, and the sky was already starting to darken with the first signs of rain. I found a nail and hung the photo, standing back to admire it for a moment before moving on with my evening. At first glance, it was just an old photograph of a house. Nothing more, nothing less. But there was something about it that stuck with me, even after I walked away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, a detail maybe, hidden in the shadows of the picture. But I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the gloomy weather outside playing tricks on my mind. I turned off the hallway light and went about my night, not giving the picture another thought. Until the next day. The next morning, I passed the photo on my way downstairs, barely paying attention to it at first. But something made me stop halfway down the stairs, a nagging sense that something was off. I turned back, and that's when I noticed it. There was a figure in the window of the house in the photograph. A shadow, just barely visible, standing behind the glass. I was sure it hadn't been there before. The picture had been just of the house, nothing more. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to convince myself I'd simply missed it the day before. Maybe it was always there, a trick of the light or a smudge on the glass, something I hadn't noticed. But it didn't feel that way. It felt different, like the photo had changed overnight, like the figure had appeared while I wasn't looking. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a photograph after all, not something that could change on its own. But that didn't stop me from looking at it again later that day, and again the next morning. Each time I passed it, I couldn't resist glancing at the figure, wondering if it had moved, wondering if it had always been there. By the third day, I was sure of it. The figure was closer to the window now, more distinct, as if it were stepping out of the shadows. I tried to tell a friend about it, just to get another opinion, but when they came over to look, they saw nothing unusual. To them, it was just an old photograph of a house, no figure in the window, nothing strange at all. It was like I was seeing something that wasn't really there, something only visible to me. And that's when the uneasy feeling started to creep in. I couldn't let it go. I found myself staring at the photograph more and more, waiting to see what would happen next. I even took a picture of it with my phone, just to compare. But in the photo on my phone, the figure didn't appear. The house was empty. Just like it had been when I first bought it. It didn't make any sense. And yet, I couldn't walk away from it. A week had passed, and the photograph had completely taken over my thoughts. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed like every time I walked by, there was something new to notice, something different about the image. The figure was no longer just in the window. Now it seemed to be standing on the porch of the house, its outline clearer than ever. There were no details to make out, just the shape of a person, standing there, watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. That's when I decided to track down the house, to see if it still existed, to see if there was an explanation for what I was seeing. It wasn't hard to find. After a bit of digging online, I discovered that the house was located just outside of town in an area that had long since fallen into decay. I drove out there, my mind racing with questions. Part of me expected to find the house in perfect condition, just like in the photo. But when I arrived, what I saw was far from that. The house was in ruins. The roof had caved in, and the windows were broken. The porch had rotted away, and the whole place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. And yet, it was unmistakably the same house. I got out of the car, standing there in the drizzle, staring at the wreck of a place that had been haunting me for days. That's when I felt it. The sensation that I wasn't alone, that someone was watching me. I turned, expecting to see another car, a person, something. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the overgrown trees. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me as I walked closer to the house, as I stepped onto what was left of the porch. I glanced up at the window, the same window from the photograph, half expecting to see the figure standing there, staring down at me. But there was nothing. No one. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that someone was nearby, watching every move I made. I pushed open the front door, the wood creaking under my hand. Inside, the house was even worse off than I had imagined. Dust hung in the air, and the floorboards were soft underfoot, threatening to collapse at any moment. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected to find. Photos, dozens of them, scattered across the floor, pinned to the walls, all of them black and white, all of them showing different angles of the house. And in every single one of them, there was a figure, just like in the photograph I had bought. I knelt down, picking up one of the photos. It was of the living room, the same room I was standing in now. And there, in the corner of the photo, was the shadowy figure. But this time, it wasn't just a blur, it was clear. It was a man, standing, watching, just like he had been in the photograph in my house. That's when it hit me. The photograph wasn't haunted. It was a tool, a lure. Someone had been using it to watch me, to track my movements, to lure me to this house. I stood up, looking around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever had taken these photos was still out there, and they knew I was here. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of the house, back to my car, and drove straight to the nearest police station. I told them everything about the photograph, about the house, about the man I had seen in the photos. They didn't dismiss me, but they were skeptical, until they sent officers out to the house and found the photos for themselves. It turned out that the house had been the site of a series of unsolved disappearances, going back decades. The man in the photos, he had been a suspect once, but no one had ever been able to prove his involvement. And now, they believed he had been watching me, using the photograph to draw me in, to make me his next victim. The police promised to investigate, but I knew the truth. He was still out there, and he wasn't done with me yet. Even now, months later, I can't escape the feeling that he's still watching, that one day I'll receive another photograph. And this time, it will be of my own house. I moved into my new apartment a few months ago, after my breakup with Emily. It was one of those clean breaks, but still, I was feeling off, like something was missing in my life. Mark, my best friend, helped me move in. He's been my rock since college, always the guy I could lean on, though lately, things felt weird between us. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but there was a tension I couldn't quite place. On the day I moved, we stopped by this antique shop downtown, just to kill time. That's where I saw it. The mirror. It was huge, with this ornate gold frame. Definitely old. And for some reason I was drawn to it immediately. Mark made a face when I pointed it out. "I don't know, man, it looks kinda creepy," he said, half joking, but I brushed it off. I bought the mirror and brought it home, putting it up in my bedroom. That's when things started to feel off. At first it was small stuff. Sometimes my reflection seemed delayed, just a second or two. I figured it was nothing, maybe my eyes playing tricks on me. But as the days went on, the weirdness kept growing. It didn't stop with the reflection. After a couple of weeks, I started seeing things in the mirror. Just flashes at first, like a shadow behind me that vanished when I turned around. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my mind being overactive, but it kept happening. One night, I swear I saw something that looked like me in the mirror, but my reflection was different. It was me, but with a twisted, angry expression, eyes too dark and hollow. I freaked out, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, everything seemed normal. I told Mark about it the next day when he came by for a beer. He just laughed it off, told me I was probably stressed from work or that I needed to get out more. "Dude, you're spending way too much time alone in here," he said, shaking his head. He wasn't wrong. I was working from home, barely socializing, and my sleep schedule was a mess. But the visions got worse, more frequent. Sometimes the reflection would glitch like a bad TV signal, flickering in and out. I stopped sleeping well. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching me. Every time I found myself staring at the mirror, almost hypnotized. Then came the night that pushed me over the edge. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when I heard this faint, scraping noise. It was coming from the mirror. I sat up and looked, my heart pounding. At first I saw nothing but my own reflection, tired and drawn. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something moving behind me. It was a shadowy figure, barely visible, creeping closer in the reflection. I jumped up and spun around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, just standing behind me. That's when I snapped. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the mirror, smashing it to pieces. The shards scattered across the floor, reflecting tiny fragments of the room. But in one of the larger pieces, I could still see the shadow for a split second before it faded. My chest was heaving, my mind racing. It felt like I'd just escaped something terrible, but I didn't know what. I called Mark immediately, telling him what had happened. He sounded half asleep but said he'd come over. When he arrived, I was a wreck, pacing back and forth. Mark listened quietly as I ranted about the mirror, the visions, everything. But instead of reassuring me, he just stood there, a weird look on his face. As Mark sat there, watching me unravel, something clicked in my head. There was this cold, almost smug expression on his face that I hadn't noticed before. And that's when it hit me. All this time, it wasn't the mirror that was haunted, it was Mark. I started thinking back on the last few months, and things began to line up. The times Mark had been at my place when things had gone missing or moved. The nights I'd heard strange noises, only to find my door unlocked the next morning. Mark had access to my apartment. He had a spare key from when I moved in. I scanned the room, and something caught my eye. A small, hidden camera tucked behind a bookshelf, its tiny lens barely visible. I couldn't believe it. Mark had been watching me, manipulating me. I felt sick. I confronted him right then and there, demanding an explanation. At first, he played dumb, but when I pointed out the camera, his expression changed. He smiled, this cold, twisted grin. "You needed this," he said calmly, like he was doing me a favor. "You were always so full of yourself. I just wanted you to see what it felt like to fall apart." My blood ran cold. Mark had been messing with my head for months, using the mirror and his access to my apartment to make me question my sanity. He'd rigged the mirror with projectors, creating those visions I'd been seeing. The delays in my reflection, all controlled remotely from his phone. I had been spiraling into madness, and he'd been pulling the strings the whole time. I kicked Mark out that night, and the next day I reported him to the police. They found the cameras he'd planted, but it wasn't enough for a serious charge. Mark denied everything, of course, and with no physical harm done, the authorities couldn't do much. They warned him to stay away, but that was it. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could, trying to start over somewhere new. But the paranoia didn't leave me. Every time I walk into a room with a mirror, I feel that same tension, that sense of being watched. I know logically that Mark is out of my life, but part of me can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. The last time I saw him, we didn't speak. He was across the street, standing in the shadows, just watching. I swear I saw him smile. Now, whenever I see my reflection, I always wonder, is it really me? Or is it something else, lurking behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike again? It started with one of those weekends that had no real plans but too much time to fill. The four of us, Sarah, Jack, Emma, and me, had been trying to get away from the city. Emma was the one who suggested camping. We didn't really take it seriously at first, but the more we thought about it, the more we liked the idea. She mentioned a place she'd read about online. The Echoing Forest, they called it. I hadn't heard of it before, but the name alone had a weird appeal. Supposedly, people heard strange noises there, sometimes distant, sometimes too close for comfort. The kind of place where urban legends get born and they live on to scare off kids and tourists. But we weren't kids, and we weren't tourists. We just wanted a weekend in the woods, some peace and quiet, a little whiskey by the fire. So, Saturday morning, we packed up our gear, threw it all into Jack's beat-up truck, and headed out. The drive took longer than I expected. As we left the city behind, the skies darkened and rain began to fall. Not heavy, just a steady drizzle that made the road feel endless. Jack kept laughing about how perfect it was. Rain in the haunted woods, classic horror setup. What could go wrong? None of us answered, but there was this quiet tension in the air. We pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that wound between towering trees. The deeper we drove into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The rain hadn't let up and everything around us seemed darker, more closed in. When we finally parked, the sky was an oppressive gray and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. We stepped out, boots sinking into the damp earth, and I could already feel that unease creeping in. But we didn't mention it. We just set up camp, huddling under a tarp as we worked to get a fire going. Emma was already laughing about the lost souls that were supposed to haunt the place. Jack kept up his usual banter, saying we should be more afraid of bears than ghosts. Sarah, though, seemed quieter than usual. She kept glancing around like she was waiting for something to happen. That's when I first heard it. It wasn't much, just a faint, distant sound, like a cry carried by the wind, but too far away to make sense of. I didn't say anything at the time. I figured it was just some animal, or maybe even the trees shifting in the breeze. But that sound stuck with me. A little reminder that maybe, just maybe, we weren't as alone as we thought. By the time we settled around the fire, night had fallen completely. The rain had finally slowed, but it left the air heavy and damp. Everything around us felt still, almost too still. We joked, passed around a bottle of whiskey, and tried to ignore the growing sense of isolation. Emma was the first to break the silence. Did anyone else hear that? We all stopped talking, listened. At first there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional drip of water from the trees. But then it came again. A sound, distant, faint, but unmistakably there. It was like a scream, but muffled, far away. Jack shrugged, trying to laugh it off. Probably just an animal, coyotes or something. They make weird noises, right? But Sarah wasn't convinced. That didn't sound like an animal. That sounded like a person. We sat there listening, waiting. The sound came again, louder this time, bouncing off the trees, echoing through the darkness. Emma shifted uneasily, glancing toward the blackness beyond the firelight. It's probably nothing, but it's kinda creepy, right? Jack kept insisting it was just the wind, maybe the rain playing tricks with the acoustics. But there was something about the way the sound moved. It didn't stay in one place. It shifted, almost like it was circling us. We all sat a little closer to the fire after that. No one said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. This place, this forest, it felt wrong. And that scream, or whatever it was, wasn't going away. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night had swallowed us completely. The screams or echoes had become more frequent, more urgent. Jack was still trying to brush it off, but even he seemed tense now. None of us had cell service, and the only light came from the weak glow of the dying fire. That's when we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They weren't the rustling of animals or the wind pushing through the trees. These were human footsteps, unmistakable and close. Emma grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing. Just darkness and the occasional flash of rain-slicked branches. But the sound was still there, circling us, growing louder with each step. Jack finally stood up, grabbing a stick from the fire, holding it like a makeshift weapon. All right, enough of this crap. If someone's out there, we're not playing games. Sarah stood too, though she didn't say anything. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then we heard it again. That scream. But this time it was right there. Not distant, not muffled. It was close, too close. And it wasn't just one scream. It was multiple voices, overlapping, echoing through the trees. That's when Emma saw it. A flash of light deep in the forest, flickering between the trees. "It's a trap," she whispered. None of us argued. We knew she was right. Emma led the way, flashlight in hand, as we moved toward where we had seen the light. I don't know why we didn't just run, why we didn't head back to the truck. Curiosity, maybe? Or the need to know what was really going on. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. After a few minutes of walking, we found it. A speaker hidden behind some bushes, still playing the recorded sounds of screaming. Jack cursed under his breath, kicking the speaker over. Someone's messing with us. This whole thing was a setup. But then we heard them. Real footsteps this time, approaching fast from behind. We turned, and in the distance, we saw them. Flashlights bobbing through the trees, figures moving toward us. Not ghosts, not animals, people. And they were closing in. We ran. There was no plan, no sense of direction, just blind panic. The footsteps were behind us, relentless, chasing us deeper into the forest. Jack tripped, went down hard, but Emma pulled him up, and we kept running. It felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes before we saw it. The road. We burst out of the trees onto the dirt path where we had parked. A car was coming, its headlights cutting through the rain. We waved it down, desperate, breathless. The driver stopped, and we piled in, yelling for him to drive. Back at the police station, we told them everything. About the echoes, the screams, the people in the forest. They nodded, taking notes, but there was something in their eyes, like they had heard this story before. They mentioned other disappearances, unsolved cases, people who had come to camp but never left. But they never caught the people behind it. And as I sit here now, I can't help but feel like they're still out there, watching, waiting for their next group of campers to wander too deep into the echoing forest. The rain started as a light drizzle, barely noticeable as it tapped against the windshield. I was driving through the back roads, heading toward Ridgewell Asylum, a place I'd only heard about in whispers and old articles. The job was straightforward, an inspection of the abandoned building for the preservation group that had hired me. They wanted to know if it was worth restoring, but something about this place didn't sit right with me. I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories, but Ridgewell had a reputation, and not the good kind. Decades ago, the asylum had been shut down amidst accusations of mistreatment, unethical experiments, and a doctor who had disappeared when it all came crashing down. The man's name was Dr. Samuel Hale, and according to the rumors, he was running something darker than just an asylum for the mentally ill. But the official story was that Hale vanished without a trace, and the authorities closed the asylum to avoid a scandal. Now, the preservation group wanted to revive it as a historical site, but they needed someone to go in first, to assess the damage and see if it was structurally sound. That someone was me. The rain picked up as I neared the asylum, the once distant taps on the windshield now drumming in rhythm with my growing unease. I parked at the gate, a rusted old thing that had seen better days, overgrown with weeds and vines that looked like they were trying to reclaim the building behind it. Ridgewell stood tall, dark, and crumbling, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me through the mist. I stepped out of the car, pulling my hood over my head as the rain soaked the ground beneath my boots. The front doors were heavy, warped from years of exposure to the elements, but they gave way with a groan when I pushed them open. Inside, the air was stale, cold, and damp, and the faint smell of mold hit me as soon as I entered. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping it across the wide lobby, dust particles floating lazily in the beam. The walls were peeling, and debris littered the floor, evidence that no one had stepped foot in here for years, or at least that's what I thought. I had a map of the place, marked with key areas to inspect, but something about this job already felt off. Still, I had a job to do. I made my way down the main hallway, my footsteps muffled by the wet ground beneath me. In the distance I heard it, tapping, faint, rhythmic, but persistent. It seemed to echo through the corridors, coming from deep within the asylum. I stopped, listened, and then dismissed it as the building settling in the rain or maybe something loose clattering in the wind. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the tapping wasn't random, that maybe I wasn't alone. The tapping continued as I moved through the asylum, always in the distance, always just out of reach. The old patient rooms were my first stop, their doors hanging off hinges, rusted bed frames still bolted to the floors. I swept my flashlight over the walls, which were covered in strange etchings, almost like claw marks. It looked as if someone or something had tried to leave a message, but the patterns were too chaotic to make sense of. In one of the rooms, I found something that made me pause. A shoe, small, like it belonged to a child, sitting perfectly in the center of the floor. There was no sign of anyone else in the building, and yet This shoe looked out of place, too clean compared to the dust and grime around it. I knelt down to inspect it, feeling a chill run down my spine, but I pushed the thought aside. It had to be some leftover from years ago, a forgotten piece of the past. The tapping grew louder as I made my way toward the second floor, the stairwell creaking under my weight. At the top, I noticed something strange. A door was open at the end of the hallway, just slightly, as if someone had been there recently. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call out, but I decided against it. If someone was here, I'd find them soon enough. The door led to what must have been the old operating room, where the more intense treatments were performed. The air here felt heavier, damp with the smell of rust and decay, the surgical table in the center covered in dust. But what caught my attention was the small notebook sitting on one of the trays, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped through it, the handwriting frantic, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry or in a panic. Phrases like, "They never leave," and "He's still here," were scrawled across the pages, repeated over and over, growing more erratic as I turned each page. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway, making me drop the notebook. I hurried out of the room, shining my flashlight down the hall, but it was empty. The tapping started again, louder now, almost as if it was moving toward me. I didn't know what I expected to find, but something told me I was no longer alone in this place. I followed the noise down the hallway, my flashlight flickering in the dim light. At the far end of the corridor, a set of stairs led down into the basement, a place I wasn't planning on exploring just yet, but the tapping was coming from down there. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the air growing colder as I descended. The basement was darker, the walls damp and cracked, the ceiling low enough that I had to duck slightly as I walked. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic, and as I moved closer, I saw them. Chains, bolted to the wall, the manacles still attached. They were old, rusted, but there was something about them that felt recent, as if they had been used not too long ago. I moved further into the basement, passing by old equipment, gurneys, medical tools, all covered in dust but still intact. In the far corner, I noticed a door, slightly ajar, with light spilling out from beneath it. The tapping stopped as I approached, and for a moment, I thought I might be walking into something I wasn't prepared for. I pushed the door open, revealing a large room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. And then I saw him. A man, standing in the far corner, dressed in an old doctor's coat, his back to me, swaying slightly from side to side. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched him. He turned slowly, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, like he hadn't seen daylight in years. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he rushed at me, hands outstretched. We collided, and I fell back, scrambling to get away as he stumbled over the debris in the room. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at him, the beam catching his pale face, his eyes wide with something between fear and rage. He stopped, standing there, panting as if deciding whether to attack again. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "They never let me leave." I stared at him, unsure if he was real or some figment of the asylum's twisted past. Before I could respond, he turned and bolted out of the room, disappearing into the darkness of the basement. I didn't follow him. I wasn't sure if I should, if I could, or if I even wanted to know where he had gone. Instead, I stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. He wasn't a ghost, but he wasn't entirely normal either. There was something wrong with him, something that made me wonder how long he had been down here, hiding in the depths of Ridgewell Asylum. I remembered the notebook, the frantic scribbles, the repeated phrases, and I realized that whoever had written it had been talking about this man. Or maybe he had written it himself. I retraced my steps, looking for clues, and that's when I found the file, an old patient record, tucked away in a drawer behind the operating table. The name on the file was unfamiliar, but the details were clear. Dr. Hale had been running experiments, using patients as subjects for his twisted medical procedures. And the man I had seen was one of those subjects. He had been left behind when the asylum closed, abandoned to rot in the basement, still trapped in his delusions, still waiting for the day he could escape. But why had no one ever found him? The preservation group had assured me that the asylum had been sealed for decades, that no one had set foot in here since it was shut down. But the man's presence told a different story. Someone had been here, recently, and they had been keeping him alive, maybe even continuing Dr. Hale's work. The chains on the wall, the fresh footprints in the dust, they weren't just remnants of the past, they were evidence of something still happening in the present. I needed to leave, to get out of here and report what I had found. I made my way back to the main lobby, my mind racing with the implications of what I had uncovered. When I reached the front door, I paused, looking back at the darkened halls of Ridgewell Asylum, wondering if I had truly seen what I thought I had. The rain was still coming down in sheets as I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the mud as I hurried to my car. I reported everything to the preservation group, and they called the authorities. But when the police arrived, they found no trace of the man, no fresh footprints, no notebook, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. They said it was stress, that maybe I had let the stories get to me, but I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and now, even weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still down there, waiting, watching. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. The sound of rain tapping against the window was the only thing that felt real. The room itself was bare, just a bed, a dresser, and a small mirror hanging slightly crooked on the wall. For a moment I sat there, trying to figure out how I got here. I couldn't remember the drive, couldn't remember checking into any motel. The last clear memory I had was packing my car, telling myself I needed to get away from everything. That was it. After that, it was blank. I stood up, my legs aching, like I hadn't moved in hours. The floor creaked as I crossed the room and pulled the curtains back. Outside, the town looked ordinary enough. Rows of houses and shops, all glistening under the rain. But there was something unsettling about it. It was too quiet. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the screen remained black. No battery, no charger in sight. My shoes were neatly placed by the door, damp as though I had been walking in the rain before coming here. I slipped them on, threw on my jacket, and headed downstairs, hoping to find some answers. The lobby of the motel was small, almost claustrophobic, with outdated furniture and a smell of stale coffee. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman, her eyes fixed on a magazine she wasn't really reading. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where am I?" She didn't look up, just smiled faintly as if she'd been asked this 1,000 times. "This is New Haven," she said, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. "You're safe here. A lot of people come to New Haven to forget." Forget? Her words stuck with me as I left the motel and stepped into the rain-soaked streets. What exactly had I come here to forget? As I walked through the town, I couldn't shake the strange sense of detachment in the air. The streets were empty, except for a few people here and there, all of them moving with a kind of serene, almost mechanical calm. Their faces were blank, but not in an unfriendly way. It was more like they didn't have anything to worry about, like nothing in the world could touch them. I passed a man standing under an awning, watching the rain. When I asked him if he could tell me more about the town, he smiled softly. "You'll like it here," he said. "Once you go to the center, everything makes sense. You'll feel lighter. Everything just fades away." The center. It seemed like every person I spoke to had something to say about it. One woman I met at a cafe told me it had changed her life. "I don't even remember what was bothering me before," she said, stirring her tea with slow, deliberate movements. "Whatever it was, it's gone now. And that's all that matters." The more I heard, the more I felt like something wasn't right. It wasn't just the way they talked. It was the fact that no one could really explain what the center did. All they could say was that it helped them forget, that it made everything better. But better how? And what were they forgetting? I decided I needed to see it for myself. The next day, I made my way to the center. It was a large, modern building, much more polished than anything else in town. The rain was still falling, making the windows shimmer like dark mirrors. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by a woman behind the front desk, her smile just as calm and pleasant as everyone else's. "Welcome," she said, handing me a clipboard with a simple form. "If you're ready to let go, we can help." I hesitated, but I filled out the form anyway. Just basic information, my name, my age, nothing too invasive. But as I handed it back, something in me shifted. I wasn't sure why, but a strange unease settled in. The woman led me down a long hallway, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the silence. The further we went, the more the air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing down on me. We stopped in front of a door, and she opened it, motioning for me to step inside. The room was small, white, and windowless, with a single chair in the center. "Please, sit," she said. I sat feeling more out of place than ever, but still too curious to leave. After a few minutes, a voice came through a hidden speaker. "Welcome to the center," it said, soft and soothing, like a lullaby. "You've come here to let go of the pain, the burdens, to forget." The words washed over me, but something was wrong. I could feel it, like a fog creeping into my thoughts. I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, my limbs unresponsive. The voice kept talking, repeating the same phrases over and over. "You don't need to remember. Just let go. It's easier this way." For a split second, I considered it. Maybe forgetting would be easier. But then a surge of panic hit me, and I fought against the pull of the voice. I stood up, legs shaky but determined, and stumbled out of the room. I don't know how I made it out of the center, but when I did, everything outside felt different. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, gleaming under the streetlights like a maze of dark, slick paths. Back in the motel, I paced the small room, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my mind. Something was wrong with this place, something more than just forgetting. I pulled out a brochure I must have taken from the center, and as I read through it, things started to click. They weren't helping people forget, they were erasing them. The center was using drugs, hypnosis, something to wipe people's memories clean, leaving them in a constant state of emptiness. But why? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that everyone I had met in this town had one thing in common. They had no history, no past, no stories, nothing to define them. Just a constant state of placid acceptance. I remembered flashes now, pieces of conversations I had overheard. There were no arguments, no disagreements in this town, because no one could remember anything worth fighting for. The center was erasing more than just pain, it was erasing everything. I left New Haven that night, driving for hours, not stopping until the town was nothing but a distant memory in my rearview mirror. For days, I felt a lingering fog in my mind, like pieces of myself had been chipped away. There were moments when I couldn't remember things I knew I should. Details of my own life seemed hazy, like they were just out of reach. I contacted the authorities, tried to explain what I had seen, but when they went to investigate, New Haven was gone. The town, the center, everything. It had vanished. There was no trace of it, no record that it had ever existed. Weeks later, I still struggle with my memory. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, unsure if what I experienced was real or just a nightmare. But deep down, I know it happened, and I can't help but wonder how many others have been lost to that town. How many more will find themselves trapped in a place designed to erase them? And I wonder if I'm still whole, or if a part of me was left behind, forgotten in New Haven. It was late when I finally pulled into the hotel parking lot, the rain falling in heavy sheets. I had been driving for hours, my body aching for a break, and the sight of the hotel was a relief, even if it looked a little rundown. The neon sign flickered weakly, barely illuminating the empty parking lot. Inside, the lobby was dim and nearly empty. Just a guy at the front desk who barely glanced up from his phone when I walked in. He handed me a key, muttering, "Room 514, and pointed toward the elevator with a disinterested shrug. He didn't say much, just that the elevator was old and slow, almost like he didn't want to be bothered with me. I took the key and headed down the hall, the carpet squishing slightly underfoot, soaked from the rain I had tracked in. The elevator groaned as it climbed to the 5th floor, and I half wondered if it was going to make it. When it finally opened, the hallway stretched long and dim, the lights flickering above. Room 514 was at the far end, away from the other rooms, which struck me as a little odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately hit by the chill in the air. The room wasn't much. Just a bed, a small desk, a chair by the window, and thick, heavy curtains blocking out the rain. I dropped my bag on the bed, plugged my phone into the charger by the desk, and stared out the window for a moment. The rain was still coming down hard, and the faint glow from the streetlights barely cut through the gloom outside. As I turned back to the room, I noticed something that made me pause. The chair by the window had moved, just slightly, like someone had been sitting in it. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to figure out if I had bumped it without realizing. But I hadn't. I brushed it off, convinced myself I was just tired, and went to grab a shower. The shower helped a little, but when I stepped out, the room felt even colder than before. I walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back to check if there was a draft, but it didn't feel like the cold was coming from there. It was just in the room. As I turned back toward the bed, I stopped. The chair had moved again, just a few inches closer to the window. I stood still, staring at it, my mind racing for an explanation. I knew I hadn't touched it this time. I hadn't even gone near it. I walked over, pushed it back to its original spot, and sat down on the bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I picked up my phone, but the battery hadn't charged at all. It was still at 5%. I checked the plug, made sure it was secure, but everything seemed fine. I plugged it back in, watching as the screen lit up, confirming it was charging now. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. But as I lay there, I heard it. A faint tapping noise coming from the vent above the door. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like someone tapping their fingers against metal. I sat up, listening closely, trying to pinpoint the sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood up, walked over to the vent, and stared at it, half expecting to see something staring back. But it was just a vent, just an old, rusty vent. I went back to bed, trying to ignore the creeping sense that something was off in the room. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but that tapping sound started up again, faint and distant, like it was coming from behind the walls. I sat up, my eyes darting around the room, and that's when I saw it. The chair had moved again. This time it was right in front of the window, pushed all the way up against the glass. I hadn't touched it. There was no way I had moved it without realizing. My stomach turned as I stood up and walked over to it, my hands trembling as I pushed the chair back into place. Something was wrong. I knew it. I wasn't just imagining things. I walked over to the vent again, climbed up onto the chair, and peered into it, my heart pounding in my ears. And that's when I saw it. A small camera, hidden just behind the grate, staring right back at me. I jumped down from the chair, my mind racing as I stared at the vent, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just some old, creaky hotel with noisy pipes. Someone had been watching me. The tapping noise, the moving chair, the phone not charging. It all made sense now. I grabbed the phone from the desk and ran downstairs to the front desk, camera in hand, demanding answers. The guy behind the counter looked startled when I slammed the camera down in front of him, his face turning pale as he realized what I had found. He tried to deny it at first, said they had no idea how it got there, but the look on his face told me he was lying. I pushed harder, asking if this had happened before, and that's when he broke. He told me about a former maintenance worker who had been fired years ago for setting up hidden cameras in some of the rooms. They thought they had found all of them, but clearly they hadn't. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time, I had been sitting in that room, thinking I was alone, but someone had been watching me the whole time. The front desk guy apologized, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. I called the police as soon as I left the hotel, shaking as I explained what had happened. They told me they would send someone over to investigate, but even after I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every time I think back to that night, the image of that camera in the vent flashes through my mind. I can't walk into a hotel room without checking the vents, the mirrors, every little corner for hidden cameras. The police arrested the guy who had set up the cameras, but it didn't make me feel any better. They never found out how many people he had watched or for how long he had been doing it. And that's what haunts me the most, knowing that I wasn't the first and I probably won't be the last. It was supposed to be another boring Friday evening, the kind where you sit around, scroll through your phone, and hope something interesting will just fall into your lap. Greg, Sarah, Emily, and I were lounging around Greg's apartment, watching the rain streak down the windows in slow, lazy patterns. It had been pouring for hours, the kind of steady rain that makes you feel trapped inside. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "Guys, have you heard about Camp Willowbrook?" she asked, her voice casual, but her eyes flickered with something more. Greg raised an eyebrow, interested but playing it cool. "Isn't that the old summer camp where those kids disappeared?" he asked, already half knowing the answer. "Yeah, but there's more to it," Sarah continued, pulling up a website on her phone. "It's become this weird urban legend. People say it's haunted, but there's barely any info about it. It's like no one wants to talk about what really happened, or maybe they can't." I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. Urban exploration was something we did, sure, but this was different. There was a real history here, something dark that lingered in the back of your mind, even if you didn't believe in ghosts. Emily chimed in. "I heard something about lights being seen there at night, and weird sounds. But it's all just talk, right?" Greg, always the skeptic, shrugged. "Probably just a bunch of teenagers messing around, but we could check it out, see what's really going on." A challenge. Greg was always up for one. I wasn't convinced, but the rain outside, the dullness of the night, it all seemed to push us in that direction. The idea took root, and before I knew it, we were making plans. Camp Willowbrook wasn't far, and by the next evening, we were already on the road. The drive to Camp Willowbrook was uneventful, but the rain had only gotten worse since the night before. It was coming down in sheets now, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of the car. We'd lost cell service about 20 minutes back, and the road had narrowed into a winding, muddy path that seemed to disappear into the forest. Greg was behind the wheel, his usual bravado faltering as he squinted at the road ahead. "Are we even going the right way?" I asked, half joking, but also half hoping we weren't. Sarah checked the map on her phone, which had frozen the moment we lost service. "We should be close. Just keep going." Eventually, we reached the entrance, marked by a broken, rusted sign that still faintly read Camp Willowbrook. The letters were barely legible, worn away by years of neglect. We stepped out of the car, pulling our jackets tighter against the rain. The camp stretched out before us, overgrown and silent, the cabins barely visible through the trees. "Looks like no one's been here in decades," Emily said, her voice echoing the thought that was already in my mind. But as we walked toward the cabins, something caught my eye. There, in the center of the camp, was a campfire, or at least what was left of one. The embers still faintly glowed, as if someone had been there recently. Greg crouched next to it, running his hand over the wet ground. "This isn't old," he muttered, his voice a little too calm. "Maybe other explorers?" Sarah suggested, but the doubt in her voice was hard to miss. We walked further into the camp, the rain muffling our footsteps, but there was something else in the air. A smell. Smoke mixed with something metallic. Something off. We split up, Greg and Sarah heading toward the larger mess hall, while Emily and I explored the cabins. Each one was more rundown than the last, their roofs sagging under the weight of years of neglect, windows shattered, doors barely hanging on their hinges. But inside, something strange caught my attention. Scratches. Deep, deliberate scratches etched into the wooden walls. At first, they seemed random, but as we walked through more cabins, a pattern started to emerge. chains, cages, symbols that didn't belong in a summer camp. "What do you think this means?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just vandalism. It was something else. We moved to the next cabin, stepping over fallen branches and debris, and that's when Emily found it, a trapdoor. It was hidden beneath a rotting piece of wood, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Emily crouched down, prying it open with some effort. Below was a small, dark space. I shone my flashlight down into it, and what I saw made my stomach turn. Chains, handcuffs, old, dirty clothing. This wasn't part of the camp. This was something darker. I backed away, suddenly aware of how wrong everything was. "Let's find the others," I said quickly, pulling Emily up. We found Greg and Sarah in the mess hall, staring at something even more disturbing. A pile of mannequins, skeletons, and dolls arranged in a grotesque display, their lifeless faces staring back at us. "What the hell is this?" Greg whispered, though no one had an answer. But before anyone could say anything more, we heard it. Voices. Real, human voices, coming from somewhere behind the building. We weren't alone. We ducked behind a stack of crates, hearts pounding as the voices grew louder. At first we thought it might be other explorers, but the tone of the conversation was too serious, too businesslike. They were talking about shipments and clients, words that didn't belong in an abandoned summer camp. Then it hit us. This wasn't just some spooky old camp. This place was being used for something far worse. Human trafficking. I looked at the cages again, at the symbols scratched into the walls. It all made sense now. The traffickers had turned Camp Willowbrook into a front. They used the ghost stories to keep people away, while they conducted their operation in secret. And we had stumbled right into it. We stayed hidden as the voices got closer. Two men, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, walked past, carrying what looked like a bundle of blankets. But I knew better. Those weren't blankets. I grabbed Emily's arm, motioning for her to stay quiet as they passed. Greg and Sarah were as still as statues, their faces pale with the realization of what we'd uncovered. We needed to get out of there, but the men were too close. We couldn't risk being seen. We waited until the men disappeared into the woods, their footsteps fading into the rain. Then, without a word, we bolted. We ran as fast as we could through the overgrown trail, not stopping until we reached Greg's car. The rain had soaked us through, but we didn't care. Greg fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. We sped down the muddy road, hearts racing, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we were miles away that anyone spoke. "We need to call the cops," Sarah said, her voice shaky. Greg nodded, still gripping the steering wheel tightly. We pulled over at the first gas station we found and made the call. The police raided the camp the next day, shutting down the operation. Several people were rescued, but not all the traffickers were caught. Some had escaped, and there were rumors that they were still out there, looking for revenge. I don't know what happened to them, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain falls and the wind howls, I can still hear their voices, echoing in the back of my mind. We were lucky to get out. But I'll never forget what we found at Camp Willowbrook. The house came into view as I turned the corner onto the long, gravel driveway, its silhouette blurred by the rain that had been falling all day. It felt like nothing had changed. The same ivy crawling up the stone walls, the same sagging roof, the same air of abandonment that made me wonder why anyone would willingly live here. I hadn't been back in years. Not since the last family reunion. Not since Robbie drowned. Even after all this time, the thought of him lying there in the lake, lifeless, still haunted me. Everyone had called it an accident, but there were always rumors, whispers about the curse tied to the family heirloom, an old brooch that Caroline wore everywhere she went. I didn't believe in curses, but as I stepped out of the car and looked up the looming mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that coming back here was a mistake. The rain was coming down harder now, pelting my coat as I hurried toward the front door, the wind rattling the windows like it wanted to tear the house apart. When I walked inside, the smell of mildew and old wood hit me, and memories I didn't want to relive rushed back. The last reunion, Robbie's laughter echoing through the halls, and then silence. As I made my way through the foyer, I saw it, a photograph on the mantel. Robbie's face stared back at me, but the glass over the picture was cracked, a jagged line cutting through his smile. It hadn't been cracked the last time I was here. I shook off the unease and headed toward the sound of voices coming from the parlor, trying to remind myself that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew this reunion would be different. The rain didn't let up. It seemed to beat against the windows with more intensity as the day went on, like it was trying to keep us all trapped inside. Breakfast was tense. There were too many unsaid things between everyone. My uncles bickering quietly, my father avoiding eye contact, and Aunt Caroline clutching that brooch like her life depended on it. It wasn't until Uncle Frank's accident that the atmosphere shifted. He had fallen down the stairs, claiming he slipped on something, but when I checked, the stairs were dry. There was nothing there, no reason for him to have fallen. That's when Aunt Caroline started in with her curse talk again, telling anyone who would listen about how the brooch was connected to our ancestors' deaths. It was ridiculous, of course, but as I sat there, listening to her, I couldn't help but wonder if she believed it. Later that day, Melissa, another cousin, got violently ill. She said it must have been food poisoning, but no one else had it. The lights flickered once during dinner, and every time someone mentioned Robbie, it seemed to happen again. It was like the house was trying to remind us of something we didn't want to remember. Andrew, my estranged cousin, sat quietly throughout all of this, watching everyone like he was waiting for something. I hadn't seen him in years, not since the lawsuit he filed against the family. But there he was, acting like he belonged, and something about the way he kept watching us unnerved me more than Aunt Caroline's curse talk ever could. Dinner that night felt like a disaster waiting to happen. The rain was relentless, the windows streaked with water, and everyone was on edge. Even those who didn't believe in the curse seemed uncomfortable, as if they were waiting for something to go wrong. The conversations were forced, the laughter hollow, and I could feel the tension building with every passing minute. And then it happened. The chandelier above the dining table gave way, crashing to the floor in a shower of glass and metal. The room erupted into chaos. People screamed, chairs were overturned, and in the middle of it all, Aunt Caroline clutched her brooch, muttering about the curse. But as I looked around at the panic, I couldn't help but notice Andrew. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, calm and collected, like he had been expecting this all along. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something the rest of us didn't, something that had nothing to do with curses or brooches. I couldn't sleep that night. The house felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me with each passing hour. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by lying in bed. I crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound, and slipped into my grandmother's study. The room was filled with old family records, letters, and diaries, things no one had touched in years. That's when I found it. A sealed letter from Andrew's father to my grandmother, begging her to forgive him for the things Robbie had found out. My heart sank as I pieced it all together. Robbie hadn't drowned by accident. He had found something dark, something about the family's fortune, and he had been silenced for it. I confronted Andrew the next morning, and he didn't deny it. He admitted that everything, Robbie's death, the lawsuit, the accidents, was part of his plan. A plan to destroy the family that had destroyed him. He had used the family's belief in the curse as a smokescreen, knowing that they would be too focused on superstition to see the truth. The police came after I called them, but by then it was too late. Andrew was arrested, but the damage had already been done. The family was in shambles, torn apart by the lies and secrets that had festered for years. No one would ever be held accountable for Robbie's murder. The truth was too deeply buried, too tangled in the family's wealth and power. As I left the house for what I knew would be the last time, I glanced at the old family portrait hanging in the hallway. Robbie's face stared back at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something different in his eyes. An accusation, perhaps. Or maybe just the weight of the truth that had finally come to light. The rain was still falling as I walked away, but I knew that in some way, Andrew had won. The curse wasn't about a brooch or a haunting. It was about the family itself, the lies, the betrayal, and the darkness that had been there all along. And now, that darkness was finally out in the open, where it belonged. You know that feeling when you regret not getting to know someone better after it's too late? That's how I felt about Sophie. She was more than just a neighbor. We shared almost 5 years living across the hall from each other in that quiet little apartment complex. It wasn't the kind of place where you became best friends with the people next door. But over the years, Sophie and I had developed a kind of connection that was stronger than just casual hellos in the hallway. We'd run into each other in the laundry room or by the mailboxes, and we'd talk about little things. At first, it was just pleasantries, weather, work, the occasional chat about her cat, Jasper. But over time, it grew deeper. I'd invite her over for coffee, and sometimes we'd share a glass of wine after work, venting about our day or the strange quirks of other tenants. I remember one time, she laughed so hard when I told her about the absurdly loud footsteps of the guy in 3C that she nearly spilled her drink. She wasn't just my neighbor. She had become someone I trusted. That's why I noticed when things started to change. It wasn't immediate, but looking back, I can pinpoint when Sophie started pulling away. She stopped coming over, her door was always shut, and the warmth she used to have was replaced by this tense, almost paranoid look whenever we crossed paths. It was subtle at first, like she was hiding something. Her smile disappeared, and her conversations became short, as if she was anxious to get away. Then came the night I saw her standing by her window, staring out with this blank, haunted expression on her face. She looked lost. That was the last time we really connected. And now I can't help but think it was a cry for help. I didn't understand. A few weeks passed and Sophie seemed to vanish. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have lives. Maybe she was busy with work or visiting family. But it was odd. Sophie had a routine, and she never strayed from it too much. She'd walk Jasper every morning, take the same bus, and be home by 7 p.m. like clockwork. Her curtains had always been open, and she liked to let sunlight flood her apartment. Now they were constantly drawn. What started as concern quickly turned into a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I knocked on her door a few times, but there was never an answer. Her mailbox overflowed with letters, and the packages left by the door stayed there for days. I thought about calling her, but when I picked up my phone, I hesitated. What if she was fine, just needed space? But then, one night, as I was tossing and turning in bed, I heard it. It was faint at first, a tapping sound coming from her apartment. It was steady, like something small knocking rhythmically against the wall. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound stopped. Then out of nowhere I got a text message. It was from Sophie. "I need to talk, but not here. It's not safe." That was the push I needed. The next day, I tried to call her, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent a message back, but there was no response. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences escalated. The noises from Sophie's apartment became more frequent, tapping, thumping, and what sounded like dragging. Sometimes I'd hear the softest whispering, but I could never make out the words. It wasn't just the sounds. One evening, as I came back from work, I saw a shadow move behind Sophie's curtains. For a second I thought maybe she was back, but the figure was too tall, too bulky to be Sophie. I was rooted in place, my heart pounding, as I watched the shadow move across the room, and then it disappeared. Just like that. I was about to knock on her door when I heard a voice from behind me. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Tor Grayson, stood in her doorway, her eyes wide with worry. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said in a hushed tone. "What do you mean?" I asked. She stepped closer and glanced nervously at Sophie's door. "Something's not right in there. People say the apartment's cursed. Ever since old Mr. Holloway died in there, strange things have been happening. You should leave it alone." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. A cursed apartment? That couldn't be real. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was hiding behind Sophie's door. I couldn't take it anymore. The noises, the strange shadow, the text from Sophie. It was all too much. One night, I decided to do what I had been too scared to do before. I grabbed the spare key Sophie had given me years ago, my heart racing in my chest. I hesitated at her door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What if I was wrong? What if Sophie was just out of town? But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong. I slid the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Musty, stale air, mixed with something sour. The apartment was dark, but not empty. Furniture had been pushed aside, and there were empty food containers on the floor. The curtains were still drawn, blocking out all light, making the place feel suffocating. "Sophie?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. I walked further in, my hands shaking as I headed toward her bedroom. That's when I heard it again, the faintest whimper coming from the closet. I rushed over and pulled the door open, and there she was. Sophie, tied up, gaunt, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear. She was alive, but barely. She mumbled something, her voice weak. "He's still here, he's watching." My blood ran cold. I didn't understand what she meant until I felt a presence behind me. I turned around slowly, and standing in the doorway was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, bulky, with cold, empty eyes. The man who had been holding Sophie captive wasn't a ghost. He was real, and he had been hiding in the building for months. A former maintenance worker who had been fired after an incident, but he never left. He had been sneaking into Sophie's apartment through a hidden passage connected to the building's ventilation system. Why Sophie? Because she had found out about him. She'd seen him lurking in the basement one night, and he couldn't let her expose him. So, he kept her prisoner, making her believe she was being watched by something supernatural. He used the ghost stories, the flickering lights, the strange noises to manipulate her. It was all part of his twisted plan to keep her trapped in fear. The police were called, and the man was arrested, but the damage was done. Sophie moved out shortly after, and I haven't heard from her since. As for me, I couldn't stay in that building anymore. I moved out within the month, but the memories of what happened still haunt me. I can't stop thinking about how easily I believed in something otherworldly when the truth was so much darker. Sometimes I still hear tapping in the walls when I'm alone at night. And I wonder, what if he's still out there? It started like one of those little things you ignore at first, thinking it's just a child's wild imagination. Jason was 8 when he first told me about the shadows. I didn't take him seriously at first, if I'm being honest. Kids say all sorts of things, and Jason had always been creative with his bedtime stories. But this felt different, now that I look back. It was a Tuesday evening, I remember, because we were just finishing dinner. Jason stood in the kitchen, staring out the window like he was looking for something. I was washing the dishes, not paying much attention. "Mom, the shadows are watching me again," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I thought he was just talking about how the sun had started to set, casting long shadows in the yard. So I just smiled and said, "Shadows can't hurt you, sweetie." He didn't say anything after that, but I noticed he was quieter than usual for the rest of the evening. When I tucked him in later that night, he didn't ask for a bedtime story like he usually did. Instead, he said, "They don't like the light, Mom, but they're still watching from the corners." It was the way he said it that made me pause. It wasn't a whiny complaint or a scared plea for attention. He was calm, like he was stating a fact. I kissed him goodnight, left the hall light on, and went downstairs, brushing it off as another one of his creative stories. But after that night, things started to change with Jason. He wasn't his usual self anymore. He started spending more time alone in his room, and when I'd check on him, I'd sometimes hear him whispering, talking to someone or something. When I asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "The shadows. Mike, my husband, thought I was overreacting when I mentioned it." "He's 8, Mike said with a shrug. Kids have imaginations. Don't make it a big deal or it'll become one. I tried to take his advice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Especially after the night when Jason told me, "The shadows are getting closer, Mom. They're almost here." A few weeks went by and things didn't get better. Jason was waking up at odd hours, more frequently now, saying the shadows were watching him again. It was like a game to him, but a disturbing one. Every time he mentioned the shadows, I could see the worry growing in his eyes, but what worried me more was that he seemed to accept them, like they were a part of his life now. One afternoon I walked past his room and heard him talking again. Not playing, not imagining, but having a real conversation. I stopped by his door and listened. His words were hushed. "I can't go with you, not yet. I don't want to." My heart sank as I pushed open the door. Jason looked up, startled. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The shadows," he said quietly, his eyes downcast. "They want me to come with them." That's when I knew. This wasn't just a game anymore. Something was seriously wrong. A few days later, Jason went missing for hours. We were in the yard, and one minute he was there, and the next, he was gone. I searched the house, the backyard, the street, calling his name over and over. And then I saw him, sitting on the neighbor's porch across the street, just staring blankly. I ran over to him, frantic, asking where he'd been. He blinked up at me slowly, as if waking from a dream. "The shadows told me to come here, to be safe," he said, looking back at the neighbor's door. I didn't understand what he meant. Why the neighbor's house? Why didn't he tell me he was leaving? Something about the way he looked, so confused, made me uneasy. I didn't tell Mike about it. I knew he'd just say I was overreacting again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. That night, after I put Jason to bed, I sat in the living room, replaying everything in my head. The shadows, the way Jason kept mentioning them, the way he'd started to retreat from everyone around him. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to install a small security camera in his room. I didn't tell anyone, not Jason, not Mike. I wanted to see for myself what was happening at night. The first few nights, nothing happened. Jason slept through the night, his small figure curled up under the blankets. But on the third night, just after midnight, the screen flickered. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but then I saw it. A shadow, no, a figure, moving across the room. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes fixed on the dark shape as it hovered near Jason's bed. It was subtle, but it was there. Someone was in his room. I grabbed my phone, my mind racing as I ran upstairs. I threw open Jason's door, but the room was empty. He was fast asleep, undisturbed. The figure was gone. But I knew what I'd seen. And that's when I realized. It wasn't shadows at all. Someone had been in our house. The next morning I went back to the footage. I watched it again, frame by frame, every second making my stomach twist. The figure was real. Not a shadow, not a figment of Jason's imagination. It was a person. Someone had been sneaking into our home, into Jason's room, watching him while he slept. I sat there for hours, replaying the footage, trying to figure out who it was. And then it hit me. The neighbor. Jason had been drawn to his house, claiming the shadows told him to go there. But it wasn't the shadows, it was the neighbor, manipulating him, planting the idea of these shadows in his mind. I felt sick as the pieces started falling into place. The neighbor had always been around, always friendly, always watching. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now it all made sense. He was using Jason's imagination against him, making him believe in the shadows so he could gain access to him. I knew I had to act fast. I called the police, showed them the footage, and told them everything I'd pieced together. They arrested the neighbor that night. It turns out he had a history of doing this, using children's fears to manipulate them. He'd been in our home, watching Jason for weeks, maybe months, without us knowing. Even after the neighbor was gone, the fear didn't go away. Jason struggled to understand what had happened. He couldn't comprehend how someone he trusted, someone he thought was his friend, could do something so horrible. We did our best to explain it to him, to reassure him that he was safe now. But it was hard. Jason wouldn't sleep alone for months. He kept saying, "What if the shadows come back? It took a long time for him to understand that the shadows were never real. That the danger had been a person, not a monster. But the scars remained. I checked on him every night, even after he finally started sleeping in his own bed again. I couldn't help it. I had to make sure he was safe. One night, a few months later, I stood outside his door, listening. He was asleep, but I heard him muttering something in his sleep. I crept closer, straining to hear, and then I heard it. "He's still here, Mom." I froze, staring into the darkness of his room. There was nothing there, of course, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that the shadows might not be entirely gone. You ever get the feeling that something is watching you? Like, not in the sense that someone is physically behind you, but more like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? That's the feeling I had the first time Jake approached me at a party. I was 17, full of that dumb teenage invincibility, and hanging out with the usual crowd of troublemakers. Jake wasn't really my friend. He was more like the weird guy you tolerated because he was always around. There was something unsettling about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. That night he pulled me aside, his eyes shining with a strange intensity. "You ever feel like you're meant for something bigger?" he asked, like he knew something I didn't. I laughed it off, but he wasn't joking. "There's a group," he said, lowering his voice. "We know things. We can help you see the world for what it really is." It was vague and cryptic, and in any other situation, I'd have brushed him off. But something about his tone made me pause. Like he knew something about me. Like he saw something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. "Come to the warehouse tomorrow night," he said. "Midnight. We'll show you." I told myself it was just curiosity that made me agree. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wanted to know what Jake knew. When I arrived at the warehouse, the first thing that hit me was the cold. Not a regular kind of cold, but the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're not supposed to be there. Jake and his crew were already inside, 6 of them, all dressed in these old, ratty cloaks, like they'd stolen them from a Halloween store. It should have been funny, but it wasn't. There was this quiet intensity to the room, like everyone was waiting for something. "We're glad you came," Jake said, handing me a cloak. "Put this on. It's time you saw the truth." I hesitated. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I pulled the cloak over my head and stepped into the circle they'd formed. In the middle of the circle, there was a symbol scratched into the floor. It looked ancient, but not in a mystical way. More like something out of a history book. Jake handed me a piece of chalk. "You finish the symbol. That's how it begins." I wanted to ask what the hell he was talking about, but my mouth wouldn't form the words. I could feel the pressure in the room mounting, like the air itself was watching me, expecting me to do something. So I did it. I crouched down and traced the lines of the symbol, my hand shaking as I did. As soon as I finished, the room went dead silent. It was like the world had stopped breathing. Then Jake stepped forward. "You're one of us now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After that night, everything changed. At first, I told myself it was just a prank, that Jake and his friends were messing with me, trying to get in my head, but it didn't stop. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. In school, at home, even walking down the street. It was like I could feel them watching, waiting for me to slip up. Jake wouldn't leave me alone either. He'd show up in places where he shouldn't have been, like the park or outside my house, just standing there, smiling like he knew something I didn't. He'd text me strange messages, things like "we're always watching" or "the time is coming." I tried to shake it off, but it was getting harder to ignore. I started losing sleep and my grades tanked. My friends stopped talking to me and I stopped trusting anyone. It was like Jake and his group had crawled into my mind, turning everything upside down. The worst part was, I had no idea why. Why me? What did they want from me? One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I texted Jake, telling him I was done. I wasn't going to play their game. But Jake just replied, "You don't get it. You're already part of this." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about some ancient ritual or supernatural nonsense. They were playing me, manipulating me, trying to get inside my head, and it was working. I'd never felt more isolated, more paranoid. I couldn't trust my own thoughts. I couldn't trust anyone. I went back to the warehouse, desperate for answers. Jake was waiting, as if he knew I'd come. "You think this is a game, don't you?" he said, stepping forward. "But it's not. We've been watching you, and now we've got you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. That feeling you have? That's not paranoia. That's the truth. We control what you see, what you think. We control you. I don't know how I got out of there that night, but I did. I ran as fast and as far as I could, trying to shake the feeling that Jake was still watching me. For weeks after, I barely slept, convinced that they were still out there, waiting to pull me back into their twisted game. But eventually, the texts stopped. The strange encounters ended. I don't know why they let me go, or if they ever really did. But I've never been the same. Even now, years later, I still feel like someone's watching me. We'd been planning the camping trip for months, though I wasn't sure why we picked such an isolated spot. The valley was beautiful but remote, nestled between jagged cliffs and thick, unyielding forest. It felt like the kind of place people used to go, but had long since abandoned for safer, more accessible terrain. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sky started to dim, clouds rolling in from the horizon, threatening rain. Jake was excited, practically bouncing as he unloaded the gear from the truck, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling I'd had since we left the main road miles back. Setting up camp didn't take long, and soon we had our tent pitched near the base of the cliffs. The ground here was uneven, and the rocks looked older, worn in a way that made them seem almost out of place. There were no trails, no signs of recent hikers or campers, just nature in its rawest form. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the edges of the tent as we worked, but we barely noticed, focused on making sure everything was in place before the weather turned. The first drop of rain hit just as we finished gathering wood for a fire, and we quickly ducked into the tent to wait out the light drizzle that followed. By the time the rain stopped, the sun had nearly set, casting long shadows over the valley, the cliffs looming like silent sentinels above us. Jake was all smiles, eager to start the fire and settle in for the night, but something about the valley felt off to me. It was the kind of silence that wasn't normal, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I told myself I was just tired from the drive and the work, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, as we sat around the fire, watching the flames flicker in the growing dark, I found it harder to ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Jake laughed, telling stories about the other trips we'd taken, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. The firelight danced across his face, casting strange shadows, making him look older, more serious than usual. It wasn't until the first whisper broke through the night air that I stopped pretending everything was normal. At first I thought I'd imagined it. A faint voice, distant and barely audible, calling out from somewhere deep in the valley. I glanced at Jake, but he didn't seem to notice. His focus was on the fire, the crackling wood, and the steady rise of smoke into the darkening sky. But then it came again, a little louder this time, as if someone was just on the edge of hearing, too far away to be seen, but close enough to be heard. It was a simple word: help. I stared out into the darkness, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the valley's geography twisted the sound, making it impossible to locate. Jake didn't seem bothered, shrugging when I asked if he'd heard it, chalking it up to the wind or the distant echoes of animals. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe it wasn't. The fire started to die down, the wood turning to embers as we sat in the quiet. The only sound now, the soft patter of rain beginning again, just enough to make the ground slick beneath our boots. The voice didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep well. It felt like something was just beyond our campsite, watching, waiting, hidden in the dark corners of the valley. I woke the next morning groggy, the rain still falling lightly, a thick fog hanging in the air, cloaking the cliffs and making the valley feel smaller, more confined. Jake was already up, poking around the base of the cliffs with a stick, muttering something about finding a good place to hike. I joined him reluctantly, my boots sinking into the damp earth, the cold air biting through my jacket. The fog clung to everything, and as we walked, it felt like the valley was folding in on us, the cliffs rising higher, the forest darker, as if the world outside our little camp had disappeared entirely. The fog hadn't lifted by midday, and the rain had only grown steadier, drumming softly on the tent and surrounding trees. Jake seemed determined to explore the cliffs, even with the weather making everything slick and treacherous. We packed a small day bag and set out, the mist swallowing up the path behind us as we moved deeper into the valley, following the jagged rock face. The valley had this strange way of making distance feel distorted. What looked like a short walk would stretch on longer than expected. We climbed higher, carefully picking our way along the rocky terrain. The ground beneath our feet was wet, muddy, and gave way easily in places. It was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of rocks under our boots and the relentless patter of rain. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. We didn't talk much as we walked, just focused on the path, the fog, and the looming cliffs. Something about the air felt thick, like it was pushing down on us, but neither of us said a word about it. It wasn't until we reached a small clearing near the cliff's base that I heard it again. That voice. It came faintly at first, barely noticeable over the rain, but it was unmistakable this time, clearer, more desperate. "Help me!" I stopped in my tracks and turned to Jake, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge what we were both hearing. But he just stood there, staring up at the cliff wall like he hadn't heard a thing. I called his name, but he didn't respond right away. Just kept staring, fixated on something I couldn't see, his back rigid and tense. When he finally turned toward me, his face was pale, and he muttered something about hearing a child crying. I hadn't heard a child, just that same voice, distant but urgent, calling for help. We stood there, rain dripping from our jackets, looking up at the cliffside like it held some kind of answer we didn't want to find. Neither of us moved to get closer, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Help us, please." It echoed through the valley, bouncing off the rocks, twisting and distorting until I couldn't tell if it was coming from the cliffs or somewhere else entirely. Jake insisted we check it out. Said there had to be a cave or something hidden in the rock where the sound was coming from. I didn't want to go, not really, but I couldn't let him go alone. We made our way up the slope, the ground turning from mud to jagged rock, slick and uneven underfoot. It felt like we were climbing forever, the rain coming down harder now, making every step feel like a fight. By the time we reached the narrow opening in the cliffside, the voice had stopped. Just vanished into the mist, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the wind as it swept through the valley. Jake shone his flashlight into the cave's entrance, the light cutting through the dark, revealing only a damp, narrow tunnel that seemed to go deeper than we expected. Too deep. He was eager to go inside, convinced we were close to finding whoever or whatever was making the sound. I wasn't so sure, but I followed him in, the air inside thick and cold, carrying with it a dampness that clung to our skin, making the narrow walls of the tunnel feel even closer. We walked in silence, the only sound now the scuff of our boots on the stone floor. The tunnel twisted and curved, leading us further into the dark. Too far to turn back now. It felt like we were being led somewhere. The deeper we went into the cave, the more I started to regret following Jake. The tunnel seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, twisting in ways that didn't feel natural. Every turn felt like we were spiraling deeper into something we didn't understand. Jake didn't hesitate. He kept moving forward, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the rough walls, the beam flickering in the damp air. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just from behind, but from every direction, like the cave itself had eyes. It wasn't just the darkness, there was something else. A presence, maybe, or something lingering in the air that I couldn't explain, something wrong. Then we heard it again. The voice, clearer now, echoing through the tunnel, bouncing off the stone walls, wrapping around us from all sides. Help us. Please. Jake froze, his flashlight beam shaking as he scanned the narrow space ahead. But this time, there was no mistaking it. The voice sounded like it was right in front of us, just out of sight. I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the darkness, but there was no answer. Just that same pleading voice, almost human, but not quite. Something was off about it, like it wasn't just a person calling out, more like a memory of someone, distorted and stretched over time. We kept going, despite everything in me telling me to turn back, to leave. Jake was determined. He thought we were close to finding something, though I wasn't sure what. I wasn't even sure if he knew anymore. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a small chamber, the air even colder now, thick with the damp smell of earth and stone. The walls were rough, jagged, like they had been torn apart rather than formed naturally. In the middle of the chamber, I saw it. Old, decaying camping gear. A broken lantern, shredded backpacks, and something that made my stomach twist. A child's small, weather-beaten shoe, half buried in the dirt. Jake crouched down, picking up the shoe slowly, his face pale, eyes wide as if he was only now realizing what we had found. There were no signs of people, no bones, no bodies. Just the scattered remnants of what must have been a family, lost or trapped in this cave long ago. The realization hit me hard. These were the people who had disappeared decades ago, the ones whose voices we had been hearing. But the cave, it felt alive, like it had been waiting for us, for someone to come inside and take their place. Before I could say anything, the ground trembled beneath us, a low rumble that sent dust and loose rocks falling from the ceiling. Something was shifting, moving, like the cave itself was closing in on us. Jake stumbled back as the tremor grew stronger, the walls around us groaning as cracks split through the stone. We had to get out, now. But as we turned to leave, the tunnel entrance collapsed in front of us, a cascade of rocks and dirt sealing us in, trapping us inside with whatever was in this place. Panic set in. Jake started clawing at the rocks, trying to dig through, but it was useless. The cave wasn't letting us go. Then the voice returned louder, more insistent. Help us. Stay with us. The sound echoed through the chamber, distorting as it bounced off the walls until it was everywhere, surrounding us, pressing in. I grabbed Jake, pulling him back from the blocked tunnel, and together we scrambled toward another passageway, hoping it might lead us out. We had no other choice. We ran, the tunnel twisting and turning, but no matter how far we went, the voice followed us, growing louder, more desperate, like it needed us to stay. The air grew thinner, colder, as if the cave was draining the life out of us. The walls felt like they were closing in, the space tighter with each step, until it was nearly impossible to move. Then we hit another dead end, another collapse, no way out. Jake turned to me, his face a mixture of fear and regret. He didn't say it, but we both knew what he was thinking. That we shouldn't have come here, that we had made a terrible mistake. But before either of us could react, the ground shifted again, the tremor growing stronger. And then it happened. An avalanche of rocks and debris crashed down from the ceiling, missing us by inches but cutting off the only path we had left. We were trapped. The voice echoed one last time, soft, almost satisfied. Stay with us. The cave went silent. We stood there frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The tunnel was sealed off behind us, and there was no clear way forward. The dim light from Jake's flashlight flickered weakly in the stifling darkness. The cave had led us here, cornered us. Whatever had been calling us into this place was real, and it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of it all. How had we been so stupid? Following strange voices into a cave in a valley known for disappearances? It was like something from a bad dream, only now we were living it. Jake was pacing, muttering to himself, trying to figure out a plan. But the truth was sinking in for both of us. This place didn't want us to leave. That's when I remembered the story. Weeks before, when we were researching this trip, I had stumbled across an old article about a family that had gone missing in this very valley decades ago. A father, mother, and their 2 young kids. They had been on a camping trip, just like us. They'd set up camp near the cliffs, and then, one night, they simply vanished. Search parties found their belongings scattered across the valley, but no sign of the family themselves. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now, standing there in the dark, the cold realization hit me hard. The voices we'd been hearing weren't just random. They were the voices of that family, the missing family calling out for help, still trapped in this place after all these years. I glanced around the chamber, and that's when I noticed something strange. Carved into the stone walls, barely visible in the dim light, were old faded scratches, words, symbols, markings left behind by someone long ago. I traced my fingers along the lines, realizing with a sickening certainty what they were. Messages from the missing family. Desperate pleas for help, carved into the rock as they realized they would never escape. Jake noticed it too. His face went pale as he read the words aloud, barely able to form the sentences. "We're trapped. Help us. Can't get out. The cave is alive." The realization washed over us both. This wasn't just some tragic accident. The cave itself was holding them here, keeping them trapped in some twisted loop, calling out to anyone who would listen, drawing people in, only to trap them too. I looked at Jake, and for the first time since we entered the cave, I saw real fear in his eyes. He didn't want to say it, but we both knew the truth. The same thing that happened to that family was happening to us. We were being pulled into the same nightmare, destined to become part of the cave's endless cycle. But there was no way we were staying. No way I was going to let this cave take us like it had taken them. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the far side of the chamber. "There's got to be another way out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We just have to keep moving." I didn't argue. We had no other choice. We picked our way through the narrow passage, the walls closing in tighter, the air growing colder with each step. But the voices didn't stop. They followed us, growing louder, more desperate, more insistent. They wanted us to stay, to join them in this forgotten place. I felt the walls pressing in, the weight of the cave's presence bearing down on us. But I kept going, refusing to stop, refusing to give in. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, we saw it. A faint, glimmering light ahead, just at the end of the passage. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jake surged forward, nearly tripping over the uneven ground as he ran toward the light. I followed, my breath catching as we rounded the final corner. And then, we were outside. The rain was pouring down, soaking us to the bone, but I didn't care. We were out of the cave. I collapsed onto the wet ground, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. We had made it. We lay there in the pouring rain for what felt like forever, gasping for breath, letting the reality of our escape sink in. The dark clouds hung low over the valley, and the cliffs loomed above us like silent watchers. But we were out. We had escaped the cave that had tried so hard to keep us inside. Jake sat up slowly, wiping the mud from his face, his eyes wide and distant, like he couldn't quite believe we'd made it out. Neither of us said anything for a while. The rain continued to fall, heavy and relentless, but it felt cleansing in a way, like it was washing away the lingering grip of the cave. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. We packed up our camp in a rush, neither of us wanting to stay in the valley a moment longer. Jake kept glancing back toward the cliffs, as if expecting something or someone to come after us, but nothing moved in the mist. I could still hear the voices, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind. "Help us. Stay with us." Those words had been burned into my thoughts, and I knew they would stay there for a long time. As we hiked back to the truck, the valley felt even more oppressive than before. The rain had turned the trail into a slick, muddy mess, and every step felt like a struggle to get away from the place that had almost claimed us. The further we got from the cliffs, the quieter the voices became, but they never completely left. They clung to the edges of my consciousness, like whispers just out of reach. By the time we reached the truck, the rain had lightened up, and the fog was beginning to lift, revealing more of the valley behind us. The cliffs stood tall and unmoving, just as they had when we arrived. But now they felt different, more sinister, more alive. We didn't say much on the drive home. Jake kept the radio on, blasting some old rock station, but it barely cut through the silence between us. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. We had gotten lucky, but that didn't change the fact that something was still down there, waiting for the next set of campers to make the same mistake we had. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of the cave, of those voices that had lured us in so easily. I tried to put it behind me, but every night I'd hear them again, faint but undeniable, calling out to me in the dark, pleading for help. I did some more digging online, trying to find any mention of other disappearances in that valley, but there wasn't much. Just a few vague reports, like the one about the family, but nothing that explained what we had experienced. Part of me wanted to report it to someone, park rangers, authorities, anyone who would listen. But what could I say? That a cave in the middle of nowhere was trapping people? That voices from the past were calling out for help? No one would believe me. Jake and I don't talk about it. We haven't been camping since. We don't really hang out much anymore, to be honest. Something about that trip changed things between us. Maybe it's because we both know we barely made it out, and talking about it would make it real all over again. Sometimes late at night, when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that family, about the markings we found carved into the walls. I wonder how long they were down there, how many people have heard their voices since, and how many haven't been as lucky as we were. The worst part? I still hear them. Even now, in the quiet moments, I catch those same faint whispers, begging me to come back, pleading for help. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if it's not over. If maybe one day, I'll find myself drawn back to that valley. Back to the cave that nearly swallowed us whole. And part of me knows, if I go back, I won't make it out this time. It was early June when I first arrived at the fire lookout tower. The evening sun cast long, lazy shadows over the treetops, and the sky looked like it had been dipped in a wash of pale gold. The job seemed simple enough: spend a summer watching for forest fires, logging weather changes, and keeping the radio handy for ranger dispatch. The solitude, they had warned me, could be unnerving at times, but to be honest, I welcomed the break from my usual chaotic life back home. My tower was perched in a remote part of the state, miles away from the nearest town or campsite, which suited me just fine. A narrow dirt road wound through the dense forest, leading up to the lookout, a tall, creaky structure that had seen better days. It stood like a weathered giant among the trees, its once white paint now chipped and graying from decades of exposure to the elements. As I climbed the stairs to the observation deck that first evening, the breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, promising a night of heavy rain. The first few hours passed in relative quiet. I settled in, unpacking my supplies, organizing the small kitchen area, and familiarizing myself with the radios and weather instruments. The tower wasn't much to look at: a small living space, a bunk, and the observation deck where I'd spend most of my time scanning the horizon for smoke. I spent the evening with a cup of coffee, flipping through an old, battered field guide to the local wildlife, half listening to the distant roll of thunder as the storm crept closer. It was probably around dusk when I noticed something. It wasn't the storm clouds gathering or the way the trees swayed just before the rain started to fall. It was a movement. Far off, just at the edge of the tree line, there was a flash of something between the trunks. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird, but the way it darted between the trees made me hesitate. I stood at the edge of the deck, binoculars in hand, squinting through the growing darkness, but whatever it was had disappeared as quickly as it came. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain as it began to fall, the drops heavy and cold against the wood of the tower. I tried to shake the strange feeling that had crept over me, convincing myself it was nothing more than a fleeting shadow. But as I watched the rain pour over the darkening forest, a part of me couldn't let it go. The next day passed without much excitement. I woke to the sound of rain still tapping against the windows, a dull, persistent rhythm that seemed to swallow the usual forest noises. The storm had settled in overnight, blanketing the area in a steady downpour, making everything feel colder and more isolated. I spent the morning making my rounds, checking the radio and logging the weather conditions, though there wasn't much to report other than rain. But even with the mundane routine, I couldn't shake the feeling from the previous night. That brief glimpse of movement out in the woods had settled into the back of my mind, gnawing at me in the quiet moments. By mid-afternoon, the rain had eased into a misty drizzle, and the forest felt even more still, almost unnaturally so. I stood on the observation deck, scanning the horizon with my binoculars out of habit. That's when I saw it again. The same flicker of movement, this time closer, maybe 200 yards away, moving between the trees. It was fast, too fast for a person, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right with me. It was as if the figure slipped between the trees, appearing in one spot, and then vanishing only to reappear somewhere else, much farther than it should have been able to. I kept watching, hoping to catch a clearer look, but it was gone just as quickly as before. I lowered the binoculars and leaned on the railing, staring out into the forest, my mind replaying the strange sight over and over. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe something spooked by the storm, though deep down, I knew it didn't move like anything I'd seen before. Later that evening, I found myself going through some of the old logs and reports stored in the tower. There were records of rangers who had worked the station before me, their notes left behind for whoever took their place. I skimmed through the pages absent-mindedly until something caught my eye, a mention of a ranger named Jack, dated back to the 1950s. His notes started off routine, just like mine, but in the later entries, his tone shifted. He wrote about seeing someone or something moving in the forest. The descriptions were vague, but there was enough there to make the hair on the back of my neck prickle. He described a figure moving quickly, too quickly, just at the edge of his vision, always staying out of reach. The final entry was short, almost frantic, as if he'd written it in a hurry. "I'm going out to look," it said. And that was it. Nothing after that. No explanation, no follow-up, just silence in the pages that followed. As the rain drummed harder against the windows, I closed the logbook, feeling an unsettling connection between what Jack had seen and what I had glimpsed in the woods. That night, the rain intensified, turning into a heavy downpour that pounded against the walls of the tower. I sat at the small table by the window, staring out into the pitch-black forest below, the sound of the rain nearly drowning out everything else. The events of the past 2 days were circling in my head, looping through the brief glimpses of movement in the woods and the eerie journal entries from Jack. I couldn't stop thinking about his last note, the one where he said he was going out to look, and how it seemed to mirror my own situation. It was a strange kind of coincidence, and the more I thought about it, the more it began to feel like something more. I stayed up later than usual, unable to sleep with the sound of the storm and the weight of the strange events pressing down on me. Around midnight, I heard it, a sound cutting through the rain, faint at first but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible over the rain, but they were there, moving just beneath the tower, slow and deliberate. At first, I didn't believe it, chalking it up to the storm playing tricks on me, but the sound persisted, circling the base of the tower like someone, or something, was pacing. I moved to the window, straining to see through the rain-soaked glass, but the darkness outside was impenetrable, the forest a black wall against the night. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever was out there had come closer. I grabbed the flashlight, my pulse quickening as I stepped out onto the deck, scanning the ground below. The beam of light cut through the rain, illuminating the wet ground and the surrounding trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no figure, nothing to explain the sound that had seemed so clear just moments before. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching, waiting, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would explain what I'd heard. Just as I was about to turn back inside, there it was again. The same flicker of movement, darting between the trees, much closer than before. It was faster now, moving in a way that was almost impossible to follow, like it was slipping in and out of view, vanishing behind one tree and reappearing far beyond the next in a split second. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just moving toward the tower. It was coming straight for me. I backed up, my hand gripping the railing as the figure drew nearer, moving impossibly fast, its shape barely discernible in the rain and darkness. I could feel a wave of dread building as it got closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to focus on it, but it kept slipping out of sight, as if it didn't want to be seen clearly. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing beneath the tower, standing motionless in the rain, staring up at me, though I couldn't make out its face. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a sudden burst of speed, it was gone, vanishing back into the trees, leaving me standing there soaked and stunned. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen, but whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't just watching anymore. It was hunting. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, unable to shake the image of that figure standing in the clearing. It had moved so fast, faster than anything should be able to, and the way it seemed to vanish and reappear so effortlessly, there was no denying it now. Whatever I had seen, whatever had been pacing around the tower, wasn't just some animal or passing hiker. It had a purpose. It had come for me. Morning came slowly, the rain still falling in steady sheets, but the storm didn't offer any comfort. If anything, the gray light filtering through the clouds made everything feel worse, like the forest was closing in around the tower, waiting for something to happen. I knew I couldn't stay in the tower all day, not after what I had seen, but the thought of going outside filled me with a heavy reluctance. Still, I had a job to do, and pretending like nothing was wrong wasn't going to make it go away. I grabbed the radio, hoping to make contact with someone from the ranger station, but the signal crackled uselessly. The storm had knocked out communication, leaving me completely cut off. That's when I thought of the journal again. There had to be more in Jack's entries, something I had missed, something that could explain what was happening. I pulled the old logbook from the shelf, flipping back through the pages, my hands clumsy and eager. The final entry was the same as before, short, hurried, almost desperate. "I'm going out to look," he had written. But then, as I looked closer, I noticed something else. Just beneath the last line, there was a faint smudge, barely visible, like someone had tried to erase it. I squinted at the page, trying to make it out, and as I tilted the book under the dim light, a single word appeared. Trapped. It was faint, almost faded entirely, but there it was, just that one word, scribbled in what looked like a shaking hand. My chest tightened as I stared at it, my mind racing through the possibilities. Had Jack known what was out there before he disappeared? Was he warning whoever came after him, or was this some kind of final admission, scrawled just before he vanished? I read the rest of the journal again, looking for clues, and suddenly, all the pieces fell into place. Jack had seen the figure, just like I had, but he'd gone out to confront it, thinking it was something explainable, something he could face head-on. But he hadn't returned. And that word, trapped, it wasn't just about him. He hadn't been trapped in the forest. He'd been trapped in time. The thought hit me with a strange clarity, as if the weight of it had been building all along. The figure I'd seen, it wasn't just haunting the woods, it was the woods. Or at least, it was bound to it, caught in some twisted loop, appearing and disappearing, hunting those who came too close. And Jack, whatever had happened to him, wherever he had gone, he was part of it now, part of the cycle that kept repeating itself. A cold realization settled over me. This thing wasn't just something from the past. It was still here, still hunting, still pulling people in, one by one. I slammed the journal shut, my mind buzzing with the terrible truth. I wasn't just being watched, I was next. I couldn't stay in the tower any longer. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, but the weight of the discovery was heavier than any storm. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag, barely paying attention to what I was doing. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, away from the tower, away from the forest, away from whatever it was that lurked in the trees. The winding dirt road that led back to the main ranger station felt endless. The drive should have taken me just a few hours, but with every turn, I half expected to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, waiting for me. The rain slicked the pavement, the tires kicking up mud as the forest blurred past. Part of me wanted to stop and take one last look back at the tower, to convince myself it had all been in my head. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was no rational explanation for what I had seen. Even as I left the forest behind, a nagging fear sat deep in my gut, a feeling that no matter how far I drove, the thing in the woods wasn't done with me. Weeks passed after I left the job, but the memories stuck to me, replaying in my head over and over, especially at night. The sound of those footsteps beneath the tower, the journal with its final cryptic message, and the figure darting between the trees like it was part of the landscape itself. I tried telling myself that it was all over, that I'd made it out before anything worse could happen, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd only delayed the inevitable. I even told a couple of close friends what had happened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes, hear the disbelief in their voices as they tried to laugh it off. "You were probably just overtired," they said. "Being alone in the woods for so long can mess with your head, you know?" Maybe they were right. Maybe being out there in that tower, isolated for days on end, had done something to me, made me imagine things that weren't really there. But then I'd think about Jack, about the word he'd scribbled, trapped, and how his story had ended the same way mine had nearly begun. Every now and then, when I'm alone, I still catch myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something just outside. I never do, not really. But that doesn't make the feeling go away. There are nights when I can't help but replay it all in my mind. The figure moving impossibly fast through the trees, slipping out of sight, only to reappear closer than before. I wonder if it's still out there in that forest, waiting for the next ranger to come along, to get too close, to follow the same path that Jack and I had stumbled onto. It's funny, in a twisted way, how close I came to becoming just another part of that place. Another name in a forgotten journal, another piece of a story that keeps repeating. I don't go back to that part of the country anymore, not even for a visit. But sometimes, when I hear the rain tapping against my windows, I swear I can almost hear those footsteps again, circling beneath me, just out of sight. We had been planning this weekend for months, just me and Sarah taking a break from our hectic lives. It was one of those late summer evenings, warm enough during the day, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, you could feel a subtle chill in the air. We'd chosen a remote stretch of coastline, miles from the nearest town, with only the crashing waves and jagged cliffs for company. I had been to this part of the coast before, years ago on a family road trip, but back then I hadn't paid much attention to the old lighthouse standing alone on the bluff. Now, as we set up our tent on the sand beneath it, that towering structure caught my eye again, its silhouette outlined against the darkening sky. It hadn't been operational for decades, a relic of another time, yet it still had this presence about it, like it was watching over the empty sea, waiting for something. I remember mentioning it to Sarah, pointing up at the crumbling lighthouse as we sat by the fire, the flames flickering in the breeze that had started to pick up. She just shrugged, half listening, her focus more on getting the marshmallows to brown just right. "It's creepy," I said, not really knowing why the place unnerved me, but unable to shake that odd sensation of being drawn to it. "Old stuff always is," she replied, laughing it off, though I noticed her eyes flick briefly to the lighthouse before returning to the fire. The wind began to pick up as the evening deepened, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. We had checked the weather before we left. It was supposed to be clear all weekend, but out here the forecast could change in a heartbeat. By the time we zipped up the tent and crawled into our sleeping bags, the sky had turned completely black, clouds rolling in faster than we expected. It wasn't long before the first drops began to fall, tapping against the fabric of the tent. We lay there in the dark, the sound of the rain growing heavier, but that wasn't what kept me awake. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes open, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain and the distant roar of the ocean. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I saw it, the faintest flicker of light through the tent's tiny window. At first, I thought it might be lightning, though there hadn't been any thunder. But the light didn't flash. It stayed steady, a pale, ghostly glow that seemed to pulse in the distance, over where the lighthouse stood. I sat up slowly, straining to see through the rain-splattered window, and there it was. The lighthouse beacon was on, sweeping the sea in slow, deliberate arcs. That light hadn't been on earlier. It wasn't supposed to be on at all. For a moment, I wondered if maybe it had been some kind of automated system, a relic from when the lighthouse was still in operation, turning on during bad weather. But that didn't make sense. The place was practically falling apart. I nudged Sarah awake, whispering, "Look at the lighthouse. The light's on." She groaned, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her. "It's probably just the moon," she mumbled, not bothering to open her eyes. But I couldn't let it go. I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the rain, the drops immediately soaking through my hoodie as I stood there, staring up at the lighthouse on the hill. The light continued to sweep across the waves, slow and steady, cutting through the mist that had begun to rise off the water. I could feel something tugging at me, an urge to go up there, to see for myself. But I didn't move. I just stood there, the rain dripping down my face, watching the light flicker across the sea. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment when everything changed, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the rain had turned into a light drizzle, the kind that soaks everything without you even noticing. The fire pit from the night before was nothing but a ring of damp ashes, and Sarah was still curled up in her sleeping bag when I stepped outside, blinking in the gray light. I glanced up at the lighthouse again, expecting to see it just as dark and lifeless as it had been before last night. But there it was, silent, looming, and ordinary in the daylight, as though the events of the night before were some kind of dream. Maybe I'd imagined it, I thought, shaking off the eerie feeling from the previous evening. But then I noticed something odd. The footprints. A set of them, clear in the wet sand, leading from our campsite and winding up the narrow path toward the lighthouse. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to remember if we'd wandered up that way during the night. But it didn't make sense. The footprints were too fresh, and Sarah had been asleep the whole time. I poked my head back into the tent, nudging her awake. "Did you go up to the lighthouse last night?" I asked, knowing full well she hadn't moved an inch. She gave me a look, groggy and half annoyed. "What? No, I was out cold. Why would I?" I didn't have an answer, but the unease from the night before came creeping back. "Look," I said, pointing to the footprints. "Someone was here. Last night, maybe." Sarah pulled herself out of the tent and followed my gaze. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the trail of footprints disappearing up the path. "Maybe it was an animal or something," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Come on, let's check it out." We grabbed our jackets and started walking toward the lighthouse, the wind picking up again as we made our way along the rocky path. The closer we got, the more run-down the place looked. Boards hanging loose, windows cracked, the once white paint now peeling and stained by years of salt and rain. I half expected to find the door sealed shut, rusted from decades of disuse, but when we got there, it was slightly ajar. Sarah exchanged a glance with me, and I could tell she wasn't feeling as confident as she had been earlier. "Think someone's squatting here?" she asked, her voice lower now, like she was trying not to disturb something. I didn't answer. Instead, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, stale air mixed with something damp and musty, like wet wood left to rot for too long. The room was empty, just a few pieces of broken furniture scattered around, nothing that would suggest anyone had been living here recently. But there was something else. On a dusty table in the corner, an old logbook, its cover faded and cracked, sat open, as if someone had been reading it recently. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages, the old paper crinkling under my fingers. Most of the entries were what you'd expect. Weather reports, notes about passing ships, maintenance details, but the last few pages were different. They weren't written in the same neat hand as the rest of the book. These were scrawled, almost frantic, detailing shipwrecks that had occurred in the area, wrecks that the lighthouse keeper blamed on the light. "The light turns on by itself," one entry read, the ink smeared as if written in a hurry. "It calls to them, draws them closer. I can't stop it. It's not me." I felt a chill, not from the wind, but from something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Sarah was leaning over my shoulder, reading the words with me. She frowned, stepping back, clearly unsettled. "That's weird," she muttered, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "You don't think it's some kind of joke, do you? Like, maybe someone left that here to freak people out?" I didn't answer, my eyes still on the book. There was something about those words that felt too real, too desperate. I shut the logbook, placing it back on the table, and we turned to leave. But as we stepped out into the drizzle again, I noticed it, the light. It had come on again, this time in broad daylight. We both stopped, staring up at the beam as it swept across the gray horizon. "I thought you said it doesn't work," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I thought it didn't," I murmured back, feeling that tug again, like something from the lighthouse was pulling me in. We hurried back down the path, neither of us saying much, but I couldn't stop thinking about that last entry. It's not me. It's not me. That night, the rain returned, heavier this time, and the wind howled louder than before. We stayed in the tent, listening to the storm rage around us. But even through the thick canvas, I could see it, the light, steady, unrelenting, and for the first time, I had the sense that it wasn't guiding ships at all. It was watching us. The storm raged all night, the wind slamming against the tent in powerful bursts, the rain pounding down relentlessly. I didn't sleep, not really. I just lay there, listening to the wind howl and the waves crash violently against the rocks. Every so often, I glanced through the small window in the tent and saw it, the lighthouse beam, cutting through the rain, slow and steady, like a hypnotic pulse. I tried to tell myself it was just a malfunction, something old and broken firing up after years of disuse. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with that place. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghost stories or paranormal nonsense, but after what we had seen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse wasn't just broken. It was haunted by something far worse than I could explain. The next morning, the storm had died down, leaving everything soaked and the air thick with moisture. The sky was still overcast, the clouds hanging low over the sea, and the lighthouse, now just a dark silhouette in the gray daylight, seemed more foreboding than ever. Sarah hadn't said much since we'd left the lighthouse the day before, and I couldn't blame her. There was an unspoken tension between us now, like we both knew something was very wrong, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. We ate breakfast in silence, both of us avoiding looking up at the lighthouse. But by the time we finished packing up our gear, the light came back on. In the middle of the day, with no storm, no fog, just a pale beam of light sweeping across the ocean. "Okay, this is seriously weird," Sarah said, her voice tense, the edge of fear creeping in. "I know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside the unease was building. I wanted to leave, to pack up and go, but I couldn't. That pull, it was stronger now. Like the lighthouse wasn't just calling to ships, it was calling to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting up there, something I had to see, even though every part of me knew I shouldn't go back. "I'm going up there," I said suddenly, grabbing my jacket. Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What? Why? We should just leave. This is too freaky." "I need to know," I said, more to myself than to her. "I need to see what's going on up there." Without waiting for her to argue, I started walking toward the lighthouse again, my feet sinking into the damp sand with each step. Behind me, I heard Sarah curse under her breath before reluctantly following. The climb up the rocky path was harder this time, the ground slippery from the rain, and the wind still gusting in unpredictable bursts. The lighthouse loomed closer, its beams still cutting through the day as though it were dusk. When we reached the top, the door was wide open again, creaking slightly on its rusted hinges. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, stopping just outside the entrance. "I really don't like this." I didn't respond. I stepped inside, the stale air and the scent of decay hitting me again. The room looked exactly as we'd left it, empty, barren, except for that old logbook on the table in the corner. I walked over to it, my fingers brushing the worn cover, and opened it to the last page. The frantic writing was still there, the words scrawled in shaky, uneven lines. The light turns on by itself. It calls to them. It's not me. I flipped back a few pages, skimming over entries from the lighthouse keeper, detailing shipwrecks, fog warnings, and repairs. And then I saw it, a final entry written at the very bottom of the page, one I hadn't noticed before. I hear them calling, I hear the sea, they want me, I can't stop them. Suddenly, the beam of light intensified, flooding the room with an unnatural brightness. I blinked against the glare, turning toward the spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room. The urge to go up there was overwhelming now, like I had no control over my body. "I'm going up," I said, my voice hollow, almost mechanical. Sarah grabbed my arm, panic in her eyes. "No, don't, please." But I pulled away, stepping toward the stairs, feeling the pull grow stronger with each step. I climbed, the iron steps groaning under my weight, the air growing colder the higher I went. Above me, I could hear something, a faint sound, almost like whispering, carried on the wind. When I reached the top, the door to the lantern room was slightly open, the light brighter than I'd ever seen it, casting long, sharp shadows across the narrow space. I hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door wide. The room was empty, save for the massive, rusted light mechanism turning slowly, steadily. And then I saw him, standing on the far side of the room, just beyond the light, his back to me. The figure of a man, hunched and motionless, his head tilted toward the sea. The lighthouse keeper. I froze, staring at him, unable to move, unable to speak. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. I could feel it. The weight of his despair, his madness, his guilt. He wasn't just standing there. He was waiting for me. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally found the strength to move, I took a slow step back, my hand brushing against the doorframe. And then, without warning, the figure began to turn toward me, slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't alone. Something was with him, something from the sea, and it wanted me too. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the figure of the lighthouse keeper turned ever so slowly, his movements deliberate, like he was waiting for just the right moment to reveal himself. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening, what this place had become. The light in the room pulsed, growing brighter, then dimmer, as though it was breathing with the rhythm of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. Sarah's voice echoed from the staircase below, but I couldn't make out her words. They felt distant, as if the very air inside the lantern room was absorbing sound. The keeper finally faced me, his movements slow and deliberate, and as his head turned, my breath caught in my throat. His eyes were hollow, black, like two bottomless pits staring straight through me, pulling at something deep within me. His face, weathered and gaunt, looked like it had been carved out of stone, expressionless, except for the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. But it wasn't his face that sent a wave of cold through me. It was his hands. They were outstretched, fingers twisted and deformed, as if they had been broken and never healed, each joint swollen and bent unnaturally. And from behind him, just beyond the sweeping light, I saw them. Other figures, shadows barely visible in the pulsing glow. They moved slowly, as though they were drifting on the wind, their forms shifting and shimmering in and out of focus, like they weren't fully there. It was like they were part of the sea, like they had risen from the depths, called by the same force that had taken hold of the keeper. And now they were waiting too, lingering in the shadows, silent and still, watching. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat, as if the very air around me had thickened, weighing me down. The keeper took a step forward, his boots scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and unnatural in the confined space. I felt that same pull again, that same strange urge that had drawn me up the hill in the first place, like something deep inside was pulling me toward him. His gaze locked onto mine, and I realized then that it wasn't just me who had come to the lighthouse. It was the lighthouse that had called me here. luring me closer, the way it had lured those ships into the rocks all those years ago. The keeper's lips moved, but no words came out, only the faintest whisper of the sea, as if the ocean itself was trying to speak through him. And in that moment, I understood. He hadn't been trying to keep the light on to guide the ships away from danger. He had been trying to turn it off, to stop it, but the light had taken over, had become something else, something ancient, something alive. The sea had claimed him, and now it wanted me to, wanted to drag me into its depths, to join the others who had been pulled beneath the waves. I could hear them now, the voices rising in the wind, distant at first, but growing louder, their calls overlapping, pulling at the edges of my mind. I backed away, slowly, my feet feeling like lead as I moved toward the staircase, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, from that twisted, empty face. He took another step, the shadows behind him swirling, shifting, the figures moving closer, their ghostly forms blending into the light like they were becoming part of it. I could feel the pull intensify, stronger now, as if invisible hands were reaching out, grabbing at me, pulling me toward the keeper and the sea. I stumbled backward, my hand hitting the cold iron railing of the staircase, and for a moment I thought about running, about throwing myself down the stairs to get away. But something told me it wouldn't matter. The lighthouse had called me, and it wasn't done with me yet. I turned and fled down the stairs, the echo of my footsteps ringing in my ears, but even as I ran, I could feel it behind me, that presence, that force pressing down, closing in. By the time I reached the bottom, the door to the lighthouse was already open, and outside, the rain had started again, a slow, steady drizzle that soaked the ground beneath my feet. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, the rain soaking through my clothes, my feet slipping on the wet rocks beneath me. Behind me, I could still feel the presence of the lighthouse, looming over the cliffs, its light sweeping the sea in slow, deliberate arcs. The wind had picked up again, howling through the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper of voices, those same distant calls I'd heard up in the lantern room. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Sarah was waiting at the bottom of the hill, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear as she saw me approach. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't have the words to describe what I had seen, what I had felt. We packed up our campsite in silence, our hands moving quickly as the rain poured down harder now, the wind whipping the edges of the tent, making it difficult to fold up the gear. All I could think about was getting away from that place, away from the lighthouse and whatever force was pulling at us from the cliffs. As we threw the last of our gear into the car, I glanced back one last time up at the lighthouse, standing tall against the storm. The light was still on, sweeping across the ocean, steady and relentless, as though it hadn't stopped in years. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the top, staring down at us, motionless, watching. I blinked, and the figure was gone, but the unease stayed with me. We drove in silence for miles, the rain pounding against the windshield, the road winding through the empty, desolate landscape. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, not until we were well away from the coast, back on the main highway, where the storm seemed to ease and the world felt normal again. "I don't know what that was," Sarah finally said, her voice quiet, almost distant, "but we should have never gone there." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, the memory of the lighthouse still too fresh, too close. It was weeks before I could shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the pull of the lighthouse hadn't fully released me. Even back at home, I found myself waking in the middle of the night, the sound of waves crashing in my ears, the faintest hint of those ghostly whispers drifting through the air. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks after everything we had been through. But then one night, I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat, and I heard it. The unmistakable sound of that same light, the slow, sweeping hum of the beam moving across the ocean. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked out the window, but there was no light, no ocean, just the quiet stillness of my suburban street. I told myself it was all in my head, just remnants of that strange, terrifying weekend. But the dreams continued. Each night, I found myself back on that cliff, staring up at the lighthouse, its light sweeping the dark water, always watching, always waiting. And then, one night, I woke up to find something different. On my bedside table, where I had left a stack of old books, there was something else. A small, faded logbook. Its pages cracked and worn, the same one I had found in the lighthouse, though I was sure I had left it behind. I hesitated, staring at it for a long moment, a cold dread washing over me. With trembling hands, I opened the cover, flipping to the last page, the one with the frantic writing about the light. But there, in my own handwriting, was a single line I knew I hadn't written. It's not over. The sea is waiting. I slammed the book shut, my breath catching in my throat, unable to shake the feeling that somehow the lighthouse had followed me home. Even now, as I sit here, trying to make sense of it all, I can still feel it, that pull, faint but unmistakable, as though the lighthouse is still calling me back. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake to the sound of waves crashing against rocks. I wonder if it's only a matter of time before I answer.